There is a photograph taken sometime in the late 1930s, in the grounds of a Scottish estate, on a day that looks cold even in black and white. Two little girls stand in the frame, coats buttoned to the collar, faces turned slightly toward the camera. Between them and slightly behind, almost out of frame, stands a tall woman with dark hair and a composed expression. She is not the subject of the photograph, she never was. Her name was Marion Crawford. The girls called her Crawfie. The smaller one would grow up to become Princess Margaret. The one on the left, the one with the careful posture and the serious eyes, would become Queen Elizabeth II. Marion Crawford was 22 years old when she first walked through the door of the household of the Duke and Duchess of York. She had studied at Moray House Training College in Edinburgh. She had plans. She had a life she intended to live. She was going to work with underprivileged children in the Edinburgh slums, children who had nothing, children who needed someone to fight for them. That was why she had trained. That was the woman she intended to become. Instead, she was asked to spend a few weeks with two small royal girls while the family sorted out a more permanent arrangement. The few weeks became a few months. The few months became a year. The year became 2. By the time Marion Crawford understood what had happened to her, she was no longer a young woman with plans. She was a fixture of the royal household, and fixtures, as she would eventually learn, do not get to leave on their own terms. She stayed for 17 years. 17 years. Think about what that means in the life of a person. She arrived when Princess Elizabeth was 6 years old. She was still there when Elizabeth was engaged to the man she would marry. She survived the abdication crisis of 1936, when the entire shape of the British monarchy changed overnight, and the family she worked for was suddenly thrust from comfortable obscurity into the full weight of the crown. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She survived the Second World War, living at Windsor Castle with the two girls while bombs fell on London and the King and Queen made their daily journeys to Buckingham Palace because they believed their subjects needed to see them stand firm. Marion Crawford stood firm too, but no one was watching her do it. She postponed her own wedding, not once, not for a year or two while she found the right moment. She postponed it for 16 years because the family made clear, in the way that very powerful people make things clear without ever quite saying them directly, that it would be inconvenient for her to leave. The man she loved, George Buthley, waited. She asked him to wait. She believed that the people she had given her life to would eventually recognize what she had sacrificed. She believed a great many things about the royal family that would later prove to be wrong. When she finally retired in 1948, they gave her Nottingham Cottage, a grace and favour home in the grounds of Kensington Palace. It was the kind of gesture that looks generous until you examine it closely. A house that was not hers. A house that could be taken back at any moment by any member of the family, for any reason, without notice. What it was, in plain terms, was a leash with nicer curtains than most. She had been awarded the Commander of the Royal Victorian Order for her service, a medal, a house that was not a house, and a pension that, by multiple accounts, she considered entirely inadequate for 17 years of her life. Then came the book. In 1950, a memoir called The Little Princesses was published. Marion Crawford's name was on the cover. The book described her years with the royal family in warm and affectionate terms. It did not expose scandals. It did not reveal state secrets. It described a child pretending to be a horse. It described the young Princess Elizabeth's serious nature and her deep sense of duty. It described Marion Crawford's own love for two girls she had helped raise from childhood into young womanhood. The palace treated it as an act of war. Within months, Marion Crawford was cut off entirely. The letters stopped. The invitations stopped. The acknowledgement that she existed stopped. She was removed from the cottage. She moved to Aberdeen, to a small house 200 yards from the road that led to Balmoral Castle, because she could not bear to be entirely removed from the life she had known. The royal motorcade passed her front door every summer on the way to the estate. No one ever stopped. No one ever knocked. Her husband, George Buthley, died in 1977. After his death, she descended into a depression so severe that she attempted to take her own life. She left a note. The note said, The world has passed me by, and I cannot bear those I love to pass me by on the road. She survived the attempt. She spent her final years in a nursing home. Marion Crawford died on the 11th of February 1988 at the age of 78. Queen Elizabeth did not send a wreath. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, did not send a wreath. Princess Margaret did not send a wreath. The women she had fed and dressed and taught and guarded and loved for 17 years sent nothing, said nothing. The silence was so complete and so deliberate that it was, in its own way, the loudest thing the royal family ever did to her. And here is the question that has never been properly answered, the one the palace has always been careful to redirect whenever it surfaces. Was Marion Crawford the one who broke faith with the family she served? Or was she a woman who gave everything she had to an institution that was only ever interested in what it could take from her? An institution that had spent 17 years teaching her to be invisible and then punished her the moment she refused to disappear completely. Because these are not the same story. They look similar from a distance. Up close, the difference is everything. The palace has had 70 years to make sure you heard only one version. This is the other one. The town of Gateshead sits in East Ayrshire, in the west of Scotland, in the kind of landscape that does not invite sentimentality. The hills are low and grey-green. The farms are working farms. The people who grew up there in the early years of the 20th century grew up understanding that comfort was something you earned, that nothing was given freely, and that the distance between where you started and where you wanted to go was measured not in miles, but in years of sustained, unglamorous effort. Marion Crawford was born there on the 5th of June 1909. Her family was not wealthy. They were not connected. There were no titles in her background, no family names that opened doors in Edinburgh drawing rooms. What she had was intelligence, a serious cast of mind that her teachers noticed early, and an instinct for the kind of work that most ambitious young women of her generation were steered away from. Not marriage, not domestic service, but education. She wanted to teach. More specifically, she wanted to teach children who had been failed by every other institution available to them. The poorest children, the ones in the Edinburgh slums who grew up without enough food, without adequate shelter, without anyone in a position of authority treating their development as a matter of urgency. This is worth holding on to, because it tends to get lost in the later story. Marion Crawford did not set out to work for royalty. She did not engineer a path into the palace. She was a progressive-minded young woman from a working-class Scottish town who trained at Moray House Training College in Edinburgh with a specific and idealistic goal in mind, and the royal family was, in the plainest possible sense, not part of that plan. She finished her training in the early 1930s. Britain was in the teeth of the Great Depression. Unemployment was catastrophic. The streets of industrial Scottish cities were full of men who had worked in the mines and the shipyards and had nowhere to go now that the work had dried up. Marion Crawford saw all of this. She was not insulated from it by money or class, in the way that most of the people she would later work for were insulated from almost everything. She understood, in a way that the royal household would never quite understand about her, that the world contained conditions of genuine hardship, and that those conditions produced genuine human suffering, and that the suffering was not abstract. Before the royal position materialized, she took a post with Lord and Lady Elgin in Dunfermline. It was a governess position, practical experience, the kind of work that would sharpen her skills while she worked out her next move. She was good at it. Teaching suited her temperament. She was firm without being cold, structured without being rigid, and she had a gift that not every trained teacher possesses and that no training program can reliably produce. She genuinely liked children, and children could tell. It was through this network of aristocratic households that the connection to the Duke and Duchess of York was eventually made. The Duchess, who would later become Queen Elizabeth and later still the figure the public knew as the Queen Mother, was looking for a governess for her two daughters. Elizabeth, the elder, was 5 years old. Margaret Rose, the younger, was approaching 2. The family's position at this point was comfortable but not particularly prominent. The Duke of York was the second son of King George V. His elder brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, was expected to ascend the throne in due course. The Yorks were a secondary household. They lived well, they were well liked, but they were not the center of anything. The two little girls were not being raised with any particular expectation that the full weight of the monarchy would ever fall on either of them. Marion Crawford was asked to come for a few weeks, a temporary arrangement, while something more permanent was worked out. She arrived at the household and met the two children, and whatever she had expected, the reality of Princess Elizabeth seems to have struck her immediately as something worth paying attention to. The child was serious in the way that some children are serious, not unhappy, not withdrawn, but possessed of a quality of attention that set her apart from other 5-year-olds. She asked careful questions. She listened to the answers. She watched adults with an alertness that suggested she was taking in more than she was letting on. Marion Crawford, who had spent her training learning to read children quickly and accurately, read this one and understood that she was looking at something genuinely unusual. The few weeks passed. The family asked if she could stay a little longer. She stayed. The months accumulated. The temporary arrangement calcified into something permanent, without anyone quite deciding that this was what was happening. This is how institutions absorb people, not through force and not through explicit contract, but through the slow accumulation of days in which leaving feels more disruptive than staying, in which the work has become familiar and the people have become known, in which the path back to the life you intended has grown harder to see. By 1933, Marion Crawford was formally employed as governess to the two princesses. She was 23 years old. She had, without entirely realizing it, made the most consequential decision of her life by failing to make a decision at all. She had not chosen the royal family. She had simply not left. And the royal family, which had a long institutional practice of treating the people who served it as resources rather than individuals, with their own claims on time and happiness and the right to self-determination, was perfectly content to allow the distinction to remain invisible. The house the Yorks lived in at this time was 145 Piccadilly, a large townhouse in central London. This was not Buckingham Palace. This was not a formal royal residence in the grandest sense. It was, by the standards of the household Marion Crawford had grown up in, almost incomprehensibly large and well-appointed. But it was a family home in the way that the palaces never quite were. There were nursery rooms, there were established routines. The children woke at a certain time and ate at a certain time and had their lessons and their exercise and their hours of play in a structure that Marion Crawford was now largely responsible for maintaining. She took the work seriously. She also, almost immediately, began to find certain aspects of it troubling. The education the princesses were receiving before her arrival had been, in her professional assessment, inadequate. This was not a criticism she made publicly, not then, but it was a judgment she held, and one that shaped the way she approached her new role from the beginning. The girls were being raised in an environment that was warm and loving in its domestic dimensions, but almost entirely sealed off from the world outside. They had no contact with children their own age, from different backgrounds. They had no exposure to the ordinary texture of life as most British children in the 1930s experienced it. They were, in the language that would not exist for several more decades, in a bubble, and Marion Crawford believed, with the conviction of someone who had trained specifically to give disadvantaged children access to the world, that this was not good for them. She began carefully and diplomatically to push. She organized trips to the London Zoo, the Tube, on one occasion that would become famous later when she wrote about it, a single journey on the London Underground that was apparently the first time Princess Elizabeth had ever been in close proximity to ordinary members of the public in an uncontrolled setting. She set up a girl guide troupe within the palace, recruiting the daughters of household staff so that the princesses could have something resembling peer interaction. She took them to tea at the Yabusa. She walked them through parks. She introduced them, as much as the institution would allow, to the fact that there was a world beyond the walls. The Duchess of York tolerated most of this, sometimes reluctantly. The King, George V, was more resistant. He had views about what his granddaughters needed to know, and they did not necessarily align with Marion Crawford's views about what was good for them as developing human beings. But Marion Crawford was persistent in the way that people who have a genuine professional philosophy are persistent. Not aggressively, not in ways that generated direct confrontation, but consistently, over time, in the direction she believed was correct. She was 23 years old. She was doing battle, in small and unrecorded ways, with one of the most powerful families in the world, on behalf of two children who had no idea it was happening. She was also, in ways she may not have fully understood yet, making herself indispensable. And indispensability in a royal household is a complicated gift. It buys you access and trust, and the warm feeling of being needed. What it costs you, over time, is something harder to name, but easy enough to recognize when you look at what happened to Marion Crawford in the years that followed. It costs you the assumption that you have a life of your own. The year 1936 changed everything. It is difficult now, nearly 90 years later, to fully reconstruct the speed and violence of what the abdication crisis did to the people caught inside it. From the outside, from the perspective of history and documentary and dramatization, it has acquired a kind of narrative tidiness that the actual experience almost certainly did not have. Edward Vi fell in love with a twice-divorced American woman named Wallis Simpson. The Church of England, of which the King was the supreme governor, did not permit remarriage after divorce. The government, under Stanley Baldwin, made clear that it would not support a marriage between the King and Mrs. Simpson. Edward chose the woman over the crown. He abdicated on the 10th of December 1936, and his brother, the Duke of York, became King George VI. From the perspective of the history books, this is a clean story with a clean ending. A king who loved too well and chose too honestly, depending on your sympathies, or a king who abandoned his duty for a woman of questionable character and dubious motives, depending on the other kind of sympathies. Either way, a story with a resolution. From the perspective of Marion Crawford, standing in the household of the Duke and Duchess of York, in the weeks and months surrounding that December, what was happening was not clean at all. It was a family in crisis. It was a man, Albert, the Duke of York, who had spent his entire life carefully not being king, who had structured his identity and his expectations and his understanding of what his life would contain around the assumption that the crown was his brother's problem. Suddenly being told that the crown was his, he was not prepared for it. He had a stammer that made public speaking a source of genuine distress. He was not physically robust. He had not wanted this, and the wanting or not wanting of it was now entirely beside the point. His wife, the Duchess, was furious. The future Queen Mother's feelings about her brother-in-law's abdication were not ambiguous. She blamed Wallis Simpson with a directness and a permanence that would characterize her attitude for the rest of her very long life. She did not consider the abdication a romantic story. She considered it an act of catastrophic selfishness that had destroyed the life her husband had been promised and burdened him with a responsibility that would, she believed, and that events would eventually confirm, shorten his life. Marion Crawford watched all of this from inside the household. She was not a peripheral observer. She was present, daily, in the most intimate domestic spaces of a family going through something that had no precedent and no manual. She saw the Duke of York in the days immediately after the abdication, when the weight of what had just happened to him was still raw. She saw his daughters, who were 10 and 6 years old, navigating a change they could not fully understand. 10-year-old Elizabeth, who had been third in line to the throne the week before and was now heir presumptive, was being told by her mother and her grandparents and the entire machinery of the state that her life had just been fundamentally altered, and she was processing this with the same quality of serious, watchful attention that Marion Crawford had noticed on the very first day. The family moved to Buckingham Palace. This was not a subtle transition. The house at 145 Piccadilly, the family home where there had been nursery rooms and routines and something that functioned as ordinary domestic life, was gone. In its place was one of the largest and most formal buildings in Britain, a working apparatus of state that was also supposed to be someone's home. Marion Crawford moved with them. Of course she did. There was no serious question of her not moving with them. She was part of the household now in a way that had long since ceased to be provisional. Her own life continued to wait. She had met George Buthley. The precise timeline of their relationship is not entirely clear from the historical record, but by the late 1930s there was a man she intended to marry, a Scottish bank worker, steady and respectable, not a glamorous figure but a real one. someone who represented the ordinary life that Marion Crawford had not stopped wanting even as the years of palace service accumulated. She wanted to marry him. She wanted to have a home that was actually hers. She wanted, in terms that would have seemed entirely reasonable to any other professional woman of her generation, to stop at some point and live her own life. She raised the matter with the family. The response she received was not a refusal in the direct sense. The royal family rarely refused things directly. What they offered instead was something more sophisticated and in many ways more effective. They made it clear that leaving at this particular moment would be very difficult for everyone concerned. The girls needed her. The family was still adjusting to its new circumstances. Surely she could wait a little longer. Surely she could see that this was not the right time. Marion Crawford waited. She waited through 1937. She waited through 1938. She waited through the gathering darkness of 1939 and the German invasion of Poland in September of that year, and the declaration of war that followed. She waited through the Blitz. Through the years when German bombers came over London at night, and the city burned, and the King and Queen stood in the rubble of the East End, and were photographed, and the photographs was used to demonstrate that the monarchy stood with its people, while Marion Crawford stood in Windsor Castle, with two girls who were not permitted to be evacuated to Canada, because their parents did not believe it would be right to send them somewhere their subjects' children could not go. This was, in its way, an admirable decision. It was also a decision that required someone to stay at Windsor and keep the children safe and educated and psychologically grounded while the war ran its course. That someone was Marion Crawford. She organized lessons, she maintained routines, she kept the princesses occupied and purposeful during years when purposelessness would have been psychologically damaging. She was their constant. Their parents were present when they could be, but the King and Queen had a country to help hold together, and the person who was actually there, day after day, in the cold rooms of Windsor Castle, was Crawford. Windsor Castle during the wartime years was not comfortable. The windows were taped against blast damage. The heating was unreliable. The castle, which was already a monument rather than a home, became stranger and more austere under the conditions of wartime austerity. The princesses slept there. Marion Crawford slept there. She slept down the hall from two children who were the heirs to a crown that Hitler's government had made very clear it intended to extinguish, and she did her job, and she did not leave. She could have left. This is important. No contract could have held her through the war years against her genuine will. What held her was something more complicated than contract. It was attachment. She had, across the years, developed a genuine and deep affection for Elizabeth and Margaret. This was not performance. This was not the strategic warmth of a careerist. The girls were, in all the ways that matter, her children in the emotional sense of the word. She had known Elizabeth since the child was 5 years old. She had watched Margaret develop from a 2-year-old into a complicated, brilliant, occasionally infuriating young girl, with a gift for mimicry and a stubbornness that would eventually become one of the defining features of her adult character. Marion Crawford loved them. Whatever else happened later, whatever the palace subsequently tried to suggest about her motives and her character, the love was real, and the royal family knew it. They had always known it. The love was, from the institution's perspective, a feature rather than a coincidence. A governess who loved the children in her care was a governess who would not leave when leaving became convenient for her. A governess whose emotional life had become entangled with the family she served was a governess who could be relied upon to put the family's needs above her own, year after year, because doing otherwise would require her to cause pain to children she genuinely cared about. The institution did not engineer this. It did not need to. It simply allowed it to develop, and then allowed the consequences to accumulate, and never once suggested to Marion Crawford that her sacrifice was anything other than what devoted service looked like. She was 30 years old when the war started. She was 35 when it ended. George Butler was still waiting. The war was over. The crisis that had required her to stay was resolved. The princesses were teenagers now, young women beginning to move toward the adult lives that waited for them. There was, for the first time in years, a plausible case to be made that Marion Crawford could leave without abandoning anyone. She raised the matter again. Again the family asked her to wait. Princess Elizabeth was not yet settled. Things were still unsettled. Just a little longer. She waited until 1947. She was 37 years old when she finally married George Pla in a small ceremony at Dunfermline Abbey. 2 months later, Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony attended by most of the crowned heads of Europe, broadcast on the radio to millions of people across the world, covered by every newspaper on the planet. Marion Crawford attended the royal wedding as a guest. She had given 16 years of her life so that the woman at the altar could get there safely. She got a coffee set, 3 bedside lamps, and a dinner service as a wedding present from the Queen Mother. When Marion Crawford finally left royal service in 1948, she was 38 years old. She had given the institution 17 years. She had arrived as a young woman with her whole professional life ahead of her, and she was leaving, by the biological standards of the era, at an age when certain doors had already closed. She and George Buthley had married the previous year. She was, by the assessments of people who knew her at the time, past the age at which having children would be straightforward. The family she had always intended to have, the ordinary domestic life she had postponed through 2 terms of royal service and 1 world war, was no longer quite available to her in the form she had once imagined it. What she did have was a pension, a grace and favour home at Nottingham Cottage, in the grounds of Kensington Palace, and the Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, which is a medal awarded by the sovereign to people who have performed personal services to the crown. It is a handsome decoration. It looks impressive on paper, and it looks impressive in a display case. What it does not do is compensate a person for 16 years of delayed living. She also had something else. She had 17 years of memories, carefully accumulated, intimately detailed, covering some of the most significant events in the recent history of the British monarchy. She had been present at the abdication crisis. She had lived through the war years at Windsor. She had watched Princess Elizabeth fall in love with Philip Mountbatten, and had been, by multiple accounts, one of the few people close to the family who was genuinely enthusiastic about the match at a time when the King and Queen were still uncertain. She had a story, and in the years immediately following the war, with the monarchy attempting to manage its public image in an era of increasing media scrutiny and a British public that had sacrificed enormously and was beginning to ask questions about what exactly the institutions of the state had done in return, that story had value. The question of how the book came to exist is one that the official version of events has never dealt with honestly. The official version, the one the palace preferred and the one that attached itself to Marion Crawford's name like a permanent stain, was simple. She was a trusted servant who betrayed the family she served for money. She cashed in, she sold secrets, she broke faith. This version has the advantage of being easy to understand and the disadvantage of being substantially incomplete. The actual sequence of events is considerably more complicated, and the complications are important because they change the moral weight of what happened. In the period following Princess Elizabeth's marriage, Bruce and Beatrice Gould, the editors of the American magazine Ladies' Home Journal, approached Buckingham Palace with a proposal. They wanted to publish a series of pieces about royal life, about the family, about the upbringing of the future Queen. This was not a fringe publication making a disreputable request. Ladies' Home Journal was one of the largest circulation magazines in the United States. The proposal was, in the context of the post-war relationship between Britain and America, a culturally significant one. Britain needed American goodwill. The relationship between the two countries had been reshaped by the war, and the soft power of the monarchy, its ability to generate warmth and interest in an American public that was simultaneously fascinated by and somewhat suspicious of British aristocratic institutions, was genuinely valuable. The British government understood this. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office was, by multiple historical accounts, actively supportive of the idea that someone connected to the royal household should cooperate with the Goulds' project. The government wanted the piece written. They believed it served British interests. Buckingham Palace was less enthusiastic. The palace declined to cooperate directly, but the government's interest in the project did not evaporate simply because the palace said no. And it was in this context that the name Marion Crawford came to the attention of the Goulds. She was recently retired. She had direct, intimate knowledge of exactly the material they were looking for. She was, in a sense, the obvious solution to a problem that both the American publishers and the British government were trying to solve. What happened next is the part of the story where the accounts diverge most sharply and where the divergence matters most. George Boothleigh, Marion Crawford's husband, made contact with the Goulds on her behalf. He signed a contract. The contract was for a manuscript based on Marion Crawford's experiences as royal governess. The payment was $85,000, which was an enormous sum for the period and one that would have represented genuine financial security for a couple whose retirement prospects were otherwise modest. Several people who examined the situation subsequently concluded that Marion Crawford may not have fully understood the contract before it was signed, that Boothleigh, who was by multiple accounts a man with his own complicated history and his own financial motivations, moved faster and with less consultation than the situation warranted. There was also the matter of what the Queen Mother had or had not approved. Marion Crawford believed, or at least later claimed to believe, that the Queen Mother had given some form of permission for her to contribute anonymously to articles about the royal children. This claim has never been definitively resolved. What is clear is that the Goulds had no interest in anonymity. An unnamed former governess was a curiosity. Marion Crawford, identified by name, with her history and her access and her 17 years of intimate proximity to the future Queen, was a sensation. Her name went on the work. She appears not to have been told that this would happen until it was too late to stop it. The first indication Marion Crawford had that something had gone seriously wrong came at Christmas. She did not receive a card from the palace. This sounds like a small thing. Within the vocabulary of the royal family's social world, it was not small at all. The Christmas card was a signal, a marker of continued inclusion in the circle of people the family acknowledged and maintained contact with. Its absence was not an oversight. It was a message. She wrote to ask what had happened. The replies she received were formal and cold in a way that previous correspondence had not been. Something had shifted, and she could not quite see what it was, because the Goulds had kept the palace's response to the manuscript entirely from her. The Queen Mother had read an early version of the material. She had found it, in her own words recorded in a letter to Lady Astor, shockingly frank. She had described Marion Crawford, the woman she had employed for 17 years and trusted with her daughters, as having gone off her head. She had sent annotations. She had requested that passages be removed. The Goulds had received this communication and had not passed it to Marion Crawford. They had their own interests, and those interests were not Marion Crawford's interests, and they had never pretended otherwise. The book that eventually reached the public in 1950 under the title The Little Princesses was, by any honest assessment, not a damaging document. Readers who approach it today, expecting the kind of corrosive royal revelation that the palace's reaction implied, will be puzzled by what they find. It is warm, it is affectionate, it describes children playing and laughing and squabbling. It describes a governess who loved the girls in her care and wanted the best for them. It mentions that King George VI had moods, which was true, which was known, which was hardly a state secret. It mentions that the Queen Mother had a complicated relationship with Wallis Simpson, which was also true, also known, also not a revelation to anyone who had been paying even minimal attention to British public life in the preceding decade and a half. The Goulds had, in addition to using Crawford's name without her full understanding of the consequences, made alterations to the manuscript. Incidents were inserted. Words were attributed to people who had not said them. Marion Crawford herself expressed concern about this, writing that she feared serious implications, particularly as they reflected on her. The Goulds were not interested in her concerns. They had the contract. They had the copyright. The copyright to The Little Princesses did not belong to Marion Crawford. It belonged to the Curtis Publishing Company, which was the Goulds' organization. She had written the book, or the bulk of what went into it, and she did not own it. She could not pull it. She could not substantially alter it. She could not stop it. The book was published. It sold exceptionally well on both sides of the Atlantic. The serialized articles in Ladies' Home Journal reached millions of American readers. A version appeared in Woman's Own in Britain. The public appetite for the material was enormous, which was precisely what the Goulds had predicted and precisely what made the whole enterprise so impossible to undo once it had been set in motion. For Marion Crawford, the financial return was real. $85,000 was more money than she had ever had. It was also, as it turned out, most of the money she would ever have, because the book effectively ended her ability to earn from writing. The palace's reaction closed doors. Her reputation in Britain became, almost overnight, that of a woman who had betrayed a trust, and that reputation made certain kinds of work unavailable to her. But the money was real, and this matters for the palace's narrative, because the palace's narrative required Marion Crawford to be straightforwardly venal. A woman who had sold her story for cash, who had calculated the value of her access and traded it for financial gain. This version is cleaner and more morally satisfying than the actual situation, which involved a recently retired woman who had just given 17 years of her life to a family that had rewarded her with a pension she considered inadequate, a cottage that was not hers, and a dinner service, who was approached by publishers connected to a project that the British government itself had considered useful, whose husband negotiated a contract she may not have fully read, whose name was used in ways she had not entirely understood or consented to, and whose expressions of concern about the manuscript were ignored by the people who held the copyright. Both versions produce the same outcome. The book exists, the palace is angry, Marion Crawford is blamed. Only one of them is accurate. The palace knew which version it preferred. It had, after all, considerable experience in managing the distance between what had actually happened and what the public was permitted to understand. It set about constructing and maintaining its preferred version with the efficiency that comes from long institutional practice. Marion Crawford, for her part, spent the months after publication waiting for the storm to pass. She wrote letters. She attempted to explain. She hoped, with the kind of hope that is really a form of denial, that the people she had loved for 17 years would eventually hear her out. The letters were not answered. The storm did not pass. It simply became the weather. There is a detail from this period that tends to get omitted from the standard account, and it is worth pausing on it, because it illuminates something about the way the palace operated that the palace would very much prefer remained obscure. When the Goulds first approached the British government with their proposal to publish material about the royal family, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office did not merely tolerate the idea. By multiple historical accounts, the government actively encouraged it. Britain, in the late 1940s, was a country in difficult circumstances. The war had been won, but the winning had cost almost everything. Rationing was still in effect. The economy was struggling. The relationship with the United States, which had funded much of the British war effort through the Lend-Lease program, was now one in which Britain occupied a structurally weaker position than it had before 1939. Managing American public opinion toward Britain was not a trivial concern for the government of the day. It was a matter of diplomatic and economic substance. The monarchy was, in this context, an asset. The royal family generated the kind of soft, warm, aspirational interest in American readers that no diplomatic cable or trade negotiation could manufacture. An intimate account of the childhood of the future Queen of England, written by someone who had actually been there, published in one of the largest circulation magazines in America, was the kind of cultural product that served British interests in ways that were difficult to quantify but easy to understand. The government recommended Marion Crawford, not in the sense of personally endorsing her or formally directing her to participate, but in the sense that she emerged from the process by which the government attempted to satisfy the Goulds' interest after the palace declined to cooperate directly. She was not a random choice. She was the solution to a problem that the British government had helped to create. This context never appeared in the palace's version of the story. In the palace's version, Marion Crawford was a disloyal servant who had decided on her own initiative to cash in on her royal connections. The government's involvement, the Goulds' alterations to the manuscript, the question of what permissions had or had not been given, the fact that the copyright was never hers. None of this featured in the account that the palace allowed to circulate. What the palace understood, and what Marion Crawford apparently did not, was that the public narrative around a controversy of this kind is set in the first few weeks. After that, the shape of the story calcifies. It becomes very difficult to add complexity to a version that has already been absorbed and repeated and accepted. The palace moved quickly to establish its version. Marion Crawford, who was not an institution with a press office and decades of experience managing public perception, moved slowly and with far less effect. By the time she understood what was happening to her reputation, the understanding was too late to be useful. She tried to write. After The Little Princesses, she was offered a column in Woman's Own, the British women's magazine. She accepted it. This was, in retrospect, a decision she would have cause to regret, though not for the reasons the palace subsequently suggested. The column ran under her name but was largely ghost-written, which was standard practice for celebrity columns of the period and not in itself remarkable. Marion Crawford's name was the commercial asset, not necessarily her prose, and the arrangement was one that both she and the magazine understood clearly. For several years the column ran without incident. Then came 1955. In June of that year, the Woman's Own column that appeared under Marion Crawford's name described, in warm and specific detail, two of the great set pieces of the British royal calendar. It described the Trooping the Colour ceremony, the annual parade marking the sovereign's official birthday, a pageant of military precision and royal splendour that takes place on Horse Guards Parade in central London. And it described Royal Ascot, the horse racing meeting that is also one of the great social occasions of the British aristocratic year, attended by the royal family and covered extensively in the press. The problem was that neither event had taken place that year. A national railway strike had caused both to be cancelled at the last minute. The column had been written weeks in advance, as columns of this kind always were, and there had been no mechanism by which the cancellations could be incorporated into material that was already typeset and scheduled for publication. The issue went out. The discrepancy was immediately noticed. A woman who was supposed to have intimate knowledge of royal life had written a detailed account of events that had not occurred. The press did not treat this as an administrative error. The press treated it as confirmation of everything the palace had already suggested about Marion Crawford's character and reliability. She was not merely a traitor, she was a fraud. She had been fabricating royal content, inventing ceremonies, making things up. The fact that the column was ghost-written, that she had not personally written the offending piece, that the error was a production failure rather than a deliberate deception. None of this penetrated the coverage with any force. The column ended. Her writing career effectively ended with it. The name Crawfy, which had been attached to warmth and affection and the intimacy of a childhood spent in remarkable proximity to history, was now attached to a different meaning entirely. Within the vocabulary of the palace, and the press that took its cues from the palace, to do a Crawfy became a phrase. It meant to betray the trust of the royal family for personal gain. It meant disloyalty. It meant selling out the people who had welcomed you into their private lives. Marion Crawford, living in Aberdeen, 200 yards from the road to Balmoral, heard this phrase being used. She knew what it meant. She knew that the name she had carried for 38 years, before she ever set foot in a royal household, had been taken from her and repurposed as a shorthand for a kind of moral failure that she did not believe she had committed. She had not stopped believing that a reconciliation was possible. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating aspect of the years between 1950 and her husband's death in 1977. She had not given up on the people she loved. She continued to follow news of the royal family. She continued to hope that someone at some point would make contact, would write a letter, would acknowledge that the situation had been more complicated than the public version allowed, would offer, if not forgiveness precisely, then at least a reopening of the silence. The silence did not reopen. Every summer, the royal motorcade drove past her front door on the way to Balmoral. The cars moved at the pace that official motorcades move, not slowly, but not racing either, and Marion Crawford lived close enough to the road that she could have seen them if she had been standing at her window at the right moment. She almost certainly was, at least sometimes. She had positioned herself there deliberately. She had bought a house on that road because she could not bear to be entirely separated from the life she had known, and the road to Balmoral was one of the last remaining threads connecting her to it. No one stopped. The cars went past and the road was empty again, and Marion Crawford went back inside. George Buckley died in 1977. Whatever his role in the original book deal, whatever his motivations and whatever pressure he had applied to get the contract signed, he had also been her husband for 30 years, and his death left her alone in the Aberdeen house, with the memories and the silence and the approaching Balmoral motorcades that never stopped. She attempted suicide. She left a note. The note said, "The world has passed me by, and I cannot bear those I love to pass me by on the road." She survived. She was taken to a nursing home. She spent the remaining years of her life there, in a room that was not the Kensington Palace cottage, and not the Aberdeen house, and not the nursery at Windsor Castle. In a room that was simply the room you end up in when the world has been sufficiently thorough about making you understand that it has moved on without you. She died on the 11th of February 1988. The royal family sent nothing, no flowers, no representative, no private acknowledgement that the woman who had held the future Queen's hand through a childhood, through an abdication, through a world war, through adolescence and first love and the earliest days of adult life, had reached the end of her own. The silence that the palace had constructed around Marion Crawford was so complete that even death could not interrupt it. She was gone, and the institution that had shaped the last 50 years of her life responded to her absence the same way it had responded to her existence for the previous 4 decades. With nothing. With the particular, practiced, devastating nothing that very powerful institutions deploy when they want to make clear that a person has been not merely dismissed, but erased. Before the betrayal, before the book, before the silence and the Aberdeen house and the road that the royal motorcade drove past without stopping, there was the work itself. And the work itself is the part of this story that gets the least attention, because it is the hardest part to fit into either of the 2 versions that have competed for dominance since 1950. The palace's version requires Marion Crawford to be a disloyal servant whose inner life was always tilted towards self-interest. The romantic counter-version, the one produced by people reacting against the palace's account, tends to present her as a pure and innocent figure, a woman of perfect goodness destroyed by a ruthless institution. Neither version leaves much room for the actual substance of what Marion Crawford spent 17 years doing, which was, by any honest assessment, remarkable. She was a trained educator who had studied child psychology at Moray House in Edinburgh. This matters. She was not a glorified babysitter. She was not a woman whose primary qualification was a willingness to subordinate herself to the needs of a wealthy household. She brought to the royal nursery a professional philosophy, specific views about how children develop, what they need, what they are damaged by, and what conditions produce the kind of human being who can navigate a complicated world with both competence and equanimity. What she found when she arrived at the Duke and Duchess of York's household was, by her professional first assessment, a situation that required significant intervention. The 2 girls were being raised in near total isolation. Their world was bounded by palace walls and palace staff, and the carefully managed social occasions that the household permitted. They had no contact with children from different backgrounds. They had no exposure to the ordinary texture of British life, as most British children experienced it. Their days were structured around lessons that Marion Crawford found inadequate, routines that were more about maintaining decorum than developing understanding, and an environment that was, as she put it, regal but oddly dead. King George V, their grandfather, had definite views about royal education, and those views did not place high value on the kind of contact with ordinary life that Marion Crawford considered essential. The princesses were royal. Their education should reflect that. They did not need to understand what the London Underground felt like, or what it meant to stand in a public swimming bath alongside children whose fathers worked in factories. They were being prepared for a life that would not contain these things, and the preparation should match the destination. Marion Crawford disagreed. She disagreed professionally, and she disagreed on the basis of what she could see happening to the 2 children in her care. Elizabeth was already, at 6 years old, developing the intense self-containment that would become one of the defining features of her adult character. Whether this was constitutional, simply who she was, or whether it was being reinforced by the isolation of her environment, was a question Marion Crawford could not answer with certainty. What she could see was that the child responded differently in open, unstructured settings than she did in the formal spaces of the palace. She came alive in a particular way when she was somewhere she had not been before. Margaret was different. Margaret was 4 years younger and possessed from early childhood a quality of electricity that the palace environment both irritated and intensified. She was brilliant and restless and funny in a way that required an audience, and an audience of governesses and household staff was not, in the long run, what that quality needed. It needed peers. It needed friction and competition, and the experience of being around other children who had no particular reason to defer to her. Marion Crawford began to push for access to the outside world. She pushed carefully, because the environment she was working in did not reward directness on this subject, and she pushed consistently, because she believed the stakes were too high to let the matter drop simply because it made certain people in the household uncomfortable. She took the girls to the London Zoo. She took them to public swimming baths. She organized a girl guide troupe within the palace grounds, recruiting the daughters of household staff to provide something that functioned, at least approximately, as peer interaction. She took them on the underground, one memorable journey that would later feature in The Little Princesses, and that caused considerable anxiety among the palace staff who were responsible for the princesses' security. She took them to tea at the Uecia. She walked them through parks. She introduced them, as far as the institution would allow, to the experience of being in an ordinary public space among ordinary people. And she watched what happened to them when they were there. What happened, as she observed it, was that they became more themselves. The carefully maintained composure that was appropriate for the palace and for formal occasions relaxed into something more natural, more spontaneous, more genuinely human. Elizabeth's attentiveness, which in the palace could look like wariness, opened out into the kind of alert, interested engagement with her surroundings that Marion Crawford believed was this child's true nature. Margaret's electric quality found more appropriate channels. The palace tolerated most of this. The King George V was not enthusiastic, but he was also not in the nursery daily, and Marion Crawford was. The Duchess of York was more flexible than her father-in-law, though she had her own views about what was and was not appropriate for her daughters. And those views occasionally produced friction with the governess she had hired. The friction was managed, as friction in institutional settings usually is, through the careful calibration of how far to push and when to step back and when to push again. Marion Crawford also established a proper curriculum: English, French, history, geography, arithmetic, the last being a subject that Princess Elizabeth was reported to find genuinely difficult and that required patient, systematic instruction rather than the occasional lesson that had characterized the educational arrangements before Crawford arrived. She introduced structured reading programs. She worked with visiting tutors for subjects outside her own areas of expertise. She tried to ensure that the education the princesses received was not merely decorative, not merely the performance of being educated, but the actual acquisition of knowledge and the development of actual intellectual skills. All of this happened against a background of continuing disruption, because the household of the Duke and Duchess of York was not, during the 1930s, a stable environment. The abdication crisis of 1936 was the most dramatic rupture, but it was preceded by years of uncertainty and followed by years of adjustment. When the family moved from 145 Piccadilly to Buckingham Palace in the weeks following the abdication, the educational work Marion Crawford had carefully constructed had to be rebuilt in a new and significantly less suitable setting. Buckingham Palace was not designed as a family home. Its rooms were enormous, its corridors were long, its atmosphere was formal and institutional in ways that a house in Piccadilly, however large, was not. Marion Crawford looked at the schoolroom she had been allocated and described it as one of the darkest and most gloomy rooms in the palace. The king, to his credit, arranged for something more appropriate. But the episode illustrated the degree to which the educational work was always happening inside an institution that had not designed itself around the needs of children. Then came the war. The outbreak of war in September 1939 changed the physical conditions of Marion Crawford's work entirely. The princesses were moved to Windsor Castle for safety. The castle was large and cold and medieval in its bones, and the war imposed on it an additional layer of austerity that made it, in practical terms, even more difficult to inhabit. The windows were taped against blast damage. The heating was unreliable in the way that heating in very large stone buildings is unreliable when fuel is being rationed. The crown jewels were reportedly removed from their cases and stored in hat boxes in the castle's dungeons, which had been converted into air raid shelters for the household. The princesses slept in those dungeons when the air raid warnings sounded. Marion Crawford was with them. She was with them through the nights when they could hear, from inside the thick walls of Windsor, the whistle and scream of bombs falling on London. She was with them through the days when the King and Queen were in the capital, visible to their subjects, demonstrating that the monarchy stood firm, while Marion Crawford stood firm at Windsor with two girls who needed, more than anything else, to feel that their world had not become entirely unrecognizable. The King said it directly at some point during those years. "We could not carry on if you weren't here." This was not a formal statement recorded in a document. It was what a man said to a woman who was holding his family together during the worst years of his reign. Marion Crawford remembered it. She held on to it. The way you hold on to things that represent acknowledgement when acknowledgement is rare. She organized Christmas pantomimes. From 1941 to 1945, annual pantomimes were performed at Windsor Castle, with the princesses in the leading roles. They raised money for the Royal Household Wool Fund, which supplied wool for knitting garments for soldiers. Marion Crawford organized them. She kept the girls occupied and purposeful and connected to something that felt like normality when normality was not otherwise available. She knew, from her training and from her years of observation, that purposelessness during prolonged periods of confinement produces psychological damage in children, and she was not going to allow that to happen to the two she was responsible for if there was anything she could do to prevent it. She also, during these years, watched Elizabeth fall in love. Philip Mountbatten had been in the periphery of the royal family's life since before the war. He was royal himself, a prince of Greece and Denmark, educated at Gordonstoun in Scotland, and then at the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where the royal family visited in 1939, and where 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth met him in a setting that Marion Crawford observed closely. She noted the way Elizabeth watched him. She noted it with the particular alertness of someone who had been observing this child since she was 6 years old and who understood very well what was typical and what was not. What she saw was not typical. As the war years progressed and Philip's visits to Windsor became more frequent, Marion Crawford's understanding of what she was witnessing deepened. She liked Philip. She liked his directness, his lack of the particular kind of formal circumspection that surrounded most of the people in Elizabeth's life. She thought he was good for Elizabeth in ways that the more conventionally acceptable candidates the family occasionally floated were not. She encouraged the romance carefully and within the limits of what her position allowed, because she believed it was right. She was, by multiple accounts, one of the very few people close to the family who was enthusiastic about the match from an early stage. The King and Queen had reservations. The King's reservations were partly about Philip's European connections and partly, one suspects, about losing his daughter. The Queen Mother's reservations were more pointed. She had other ideas about who Elizabeth should marry, and she did not abandon them quickly. Marion Crawford's position in this quiet disagreement was, as it had been throughout her time with the family, on the side of what she believed was best for the two people she had raised, rather than on the side of what was institutionally convenient or parentally comfortable. She was right about Philip, as it turned out. The marriage was a good one by the evidence available, lasting 73 years until Philip's death in 2021. But being right in a royal household does not protect you from consequences. What it sometimes does is make the people who were wrong more determined to find another occasion on which to reassert their authority. That occasion would come. Marion Crawford did not know yet, in the wartime years at Windsor, what form it would take. She knew the war would end. She knew the girls would grow up, as they were already growing up, and that her role would diminish as they did. She knew that she wanted, when the time came, to leave honourably, to be acknowledged for what she had given, to take her retirement with the grace that 17 years of service earned. She planned a wedding, she planned a home. She planned, at 37, the ordinary life she had been postponing since she was 22. She had no plan for what the palace was going to do to her when she tried to take it. There is a sentence that appeared in a novel about Marion Crawford, published in 2020, written by Wendy Holden, a sentence drawn from the historical record of the woman's life rather than invented for fictional purposes. It read, "In trying to free them from their prison, she had incarcerated herself." It is a clean formulation of something that is otherwise difficult to say simply. Marion Crawford spent 17 years attempting to give two royal children access to a world their institution wanted to keep them from. She took them onto the underground. She walked them through parks. She sat with them in public swimming baths and watched them discover that other children existed, and that other children were, in the fundamental human sense, not so different from themselves. She did this work in the face of institutional resistance, year after year, because she believed it was necessary for their development. What she did not do during those same 17 years was apply the same logic to her own situation. She saw, clearly and early, that the palace environment was damaging to the children inside it. She understood that walls, even very grand walls, produce a particular kind of confinement that shapes the people who live within them in ways that are not always visible from the outside. She fought, consistently if quietly, against the worst effects of that confinement for Elizabeth and Margaret. She did not fight the same fight for herself. The reasons for this are not simple. Attachment was one of them. She genuinely loved those children, and love produces a willingness to accept costs that pure professional obligation does not. Institutional capture was another. The process by which the royal household absorbed people and made leaving feel like abandonment rather than self-determination was sophisticated and effective, and Marion Crawford was not immune to it. She had been inside the institution long enough that its logic had become, at least partly, her own logic. Leaving felt wrong, not merely because the family made it feel wrong, but because she had internalized the framework within which leaving was wrong. And there was something else, something that the available historical record only partially illuminates, but that is worth naming nonetheless. Marion Crawford believed in the institution. She believed, with the conviction of someone who had been inside it long enough to see its human dimensions alongside its formal ones, that the British monarchy was worth serving. This was not naive or unconsidered. She had seen the king during the abdication crisis and during the war years. She had watched George VI carry a burden he had not sought and had not wanted, and had watched him carry it with a kind of dogged, exhausted integrity that she found genuinely admirable. She had seen the Queen Mother operate in the public spaces of wartime Britain with a warmth and a steadiness that generated real loyalty in the people who witnessed it. She was not serving an abstraction. She was serving people she knew, people she had watched under pressure, people whose private faces she understood in ways that the public could not. And her belief in those people, the human rather than the institutional versions of them, was what made the eventual silence so total in its devastation. Because the silence was not simply professional. Marion Crawford was not merely a disappointed employee whose contract had ended badly. She was a woman who had given 17 years to people she loved, who had organized Christmas pantomimes in a castle while bombs fell on London, because she believed the children needed to feel that life was still worth something, who had quietly, persistently fought for those children to have access to ordinary human experience, because she believed it would make them better people and perhaps even a better monarch. She believed all of this. She believed it was mutual. She believed, in the way that people who have been inside a close domestic situation for 17 years tend to believe, that the relationship was real in both directions, that the warmth she felt was returned, that the acknowledgement the king had offered, "We could not carry on if you weren't here," represented something durable rather than something situational. She was wrong about this, not entirely wrong. Elizabeth's feelings about Crawford appear, from the historical record, to have been genuine in the years of their shared daily life. The letters she sent, some of which Marion Crawford later reproduced in the book in ways the palace found objectionable, were warm and personal in ways that formal correspondence is not. Margaret's feelings were also real, shaped by the particular bond that forms between a child and the adult who is present at every significant moment of her early years. But feelings in an institutional context are not the same as loyalty, and loyalty in a royal household operates according to a different set of priorities than it does in ordinary human relationships. The institution had a protocol for people who violated its boundaries, regardless of the warmth of the personal relationship that preceded the violation, regardless of the circumstances of the violation, regardless of whether the violation was as clear-cut as the institutional account maintained. The protocol was silence, total sustained institutional silence. No letters, no cards, no private acknowledgements, no quiet back-channel communications that might suggest the relationship was being preserved in any form. Nothing that could be construed as softening the message, which was, "You are gone, you do not exist, the door is closed and will not reopen." Marion Crawford did not believe, for a long time, that the door was truly closed. This is the part of the story that is hardest to read, because it is the part where the human cost of the palace's decision is most visible. She wrote letters, she attempted to explain, she asked, in various ways and through various intermediaries, for some acknowledgement that the situation was more complicated than the public account allowed. The letters were not answered. The intermediaries reported back with the particular kind of gentle discouragement that means no without using the word. She moved to Aberdeen. She bought the house 200 yards from the Balmoral Road, not because she had a strategic reason for doing so, but because she could not fully let go, because proximity to the world she had known for 17 years was the closest thing to connection that remained available to her. Every summer the motorcade went past. Every summer no one stopped. She kept following the royal family through newspapers and broadcasts. She watched the coronation in 1953. She watched Elizabeth become, over the following decades, the kind of monarch that Marion Crawford had, in her own small way, helped to make possible. The composure, the steadiness, the quality of serious, watchful attention that Marion Crawford had noticed on the very first day and had spent 17 years cultivating. It was all there, visible to the whole world now, and Marion Crawford watched it from Aberdeen and understood that her contribution to it would never be publicly acknowledged. The institution had taken what she gave and incorporated it and moved on, the way institutions do. The woman who had organized the Girl Guide troupe and walked the princesses through parks and sat with them in the dungeon shelters at Windsor while London burned was now, in the vocabulary of the palace, simply the woman who had done a Crawford, who had sold her story, who had broken faith. She had not broken faith. She had written a book that was, by any honest reading, an act of love. She had described children she adored in terms that were warm and specific and true. She had shared memories that were hers as much as anyone else's, memories she had earned through 17 years of daily presence, memories that the institution had no more right to silence than it had to the 16 years of her personal life that it had consumed while she waited for permission to live it. She believed this. She believed it to the end. The institution believed otherwise. And the institution, as Marion Crawford had ample time to understand, always wins, not because it is right, not because its version of events is more accurate or more fair or more human than the version held by the person it has decided to erase, but because it has more time than any single person has, because it outlasts them, because it can sustain a silence across decades without effort, while the person on the other side of that silence must live inside it every day, must feel its weight every morning, and carry it through every hour until the day they die. Marion Crawford carried it for 38 years. Then she died in a nursing home in Aberdeen, and the institution sent nothing, and the silence was complete, and the institution moved on to the next thing, because institutions always do. Every institution that depends on the loyalty of the people inside it develops, over time, a mechanism for enforcing that loyalty. In some institutions the mechanism is explicit. There are contracts, there are non-disclosure agreements, there are legal consequences spelled out in advance, signed and dated and witnessed, so that everyone who enters the arrangement understands exactly what they are agreeing to and what will happen if they deviate from it. The British royal household, for most of its history, used something different. It used something older and in many respects more effective than a legal contract, because it operated not on the fear of external consequence, but on the internalization of a value. The value was this: people who serve the crown do not speak about what they see, not because they are forbidden to, not because lawyers will come after them if they do, but because speaking is simply not what people of a certain kind do. It is beneath them. It is a betrayal of something they should hold more dear than money, or recognition, or the desire to be understood. It is, in the vocabulary that the institution preferred, ungentlemanly, undignified. The act of someone who has mistaken the terms of their employment and forgotten their place. Marion Crawford had been inside this institution for 17 years. She had absorbed its values, its rhythms, its unspoken rules. She knew that the royal discretion, as she herself described it, held in all circumstances. Unpleasant or bothersome matters were never discussed. The family dealt with difficulty by behaving as if it did not exist, and the people who served them were expected to do the same. She had watched the King and Queen manage the psychological weight of the Blitz by maintaining, in the domestic spaces of Windsor Castle, a surface of calm that bore no visible relationship to the bombs falling on London 20 miles away. She had maintained that surface herself. For 17 years she had been, in the precise sense of the word, discreet. She had not spoken to journalists. She had not cultivated the kind of press relationships that other people with her level of access might have found tempting. She had not written letters to friends describing what she observed inside the palace in ways that could have been repeated or published. She had kept the confidence of the family she served with the thoroughness of someone who understood and accepted the terms of the arrangement. This history did not protect her when the book appeared. The institution's response to The Little Princesses was not calibrated to the actual content of what she had written, or to the 17 years of demonstrated loyalty that preceded it. It was calibrated to the fact of the breach, the crossing of a line that the institution had drawn in invisible ink and expected everyone inside it to see and respect. The line was not drawn in any document Marion Crawford had signed. This is important, and it is a detail that tends to get lost in the standard account. There was no formal confidentiality agreement. There was a letter from the Queen Mother, written in April 1949, when the project was still in its early stages, which stated clearly that Marion Crawford should not write and sign articles about the children. The letter used a word that tells you a great deal about the institution's self-conception. People in positions of confidence, the Queen Mother wrote, must be utterly oyster, closed, sealed, silent in the way that something without a voice is silent, not from restraint but from nature. The people who served the royal family were not expected to choose discretion the way a thoughtful person chooses discretion, weighing the competing claims of loyalty and self-expression and arriving at a reasoned position. They were expected to be oysters, incapable of speech by temperament, by character, by the very nature of the role they occupied. Marion Crawford had spent 17 years being an oyster. She had also spent 17 years being a person. The institution had never quite resolved the tension between those two things. And when the book appeared, it became clear that the institution had never intended to. The oyster was the point. The person was an inconvenience. The reaction was swift and it was total. The King and Queen cut off all contact immediately. Not after a conversation, not after a period of reflection, not after any attempt to understand how the situation had come about, or what Marion Crawford's actual role in it had been. The contact stopped. The Christmas cards stopped. The door closed. Marion Crawford was not the first person to experience this, and she would not be the last. What made her case distinctive was partly its extremity, the completeness of the erasure, and partly its historical position as the first. She was, as the historical record makes clear, the first servant of the royal household to publish an account of life inside it. Before her, the code had held entirely. The oysters had stayed closed. The palaces had maintained their opacity. What happened inside was known only to those who were there, and those who were there did not say. After her, the code frayed steadily. Not immediately, not in a rush, but over the following decades, a series of people who had been inside the royal household in various capacities concluded that their experiences were worth describing and found publishers who agreed with them. A former footman wrote about Princess Margaret. Later, Diana's former butler Paul Burrell published an account of his years at Kensington Palace that made the little princesses look, by any measure of revelation, like a parish newsletter. Prince Harry published a memoir in 2023 that contained more intimate detail about the internal life of the royal family than anything Marion Crawford had produced. And he was a member of the family rather than an employee. None of them experienced what Marion Crawford experienced. Burrell faced legal proceedings that eventually collapsed. Harry faced the fury of his family and a press campaign of sustained hostility. But none of them was erased in the way that Marion Crawford was erased, because none of them occupied quite her position in the history of the code. She was the first, and the punishment for being the first was designed not merely to punish her, but to warn everyone who came after her. The punishment was designed as a message, addressed not to Marion Crawford, but to every other person inside the institution who might be tempted to do what she had done. The message was, "This is what happens. Watch what happened to Crawford and understand what will happen to you." The phrase itself, doing a Crawford, which entered the vocabulary of the palace and the press in the years after 1950, was part of the message. It converted a specific human situation, a particular woman in particular circumstances making decisions that were, at minimum, more complicated than the institution's account allowed, into a category. A type of act. A form of moral failure that could be named and referenced without the naming carrying any obligation to examine what had actually happened. To do a Crawford was to betray. The content of the betrayal, the question of whether it was really betrayal at all, the circumstances that produced it, none of this was part of the phrase. The phrase was a verdict. It did not invite appeal. This is what institutions do to the people they erase. They reduce them to categories. They take a complicated human life and compress it into a cautionary tale, and then they deploy the cautionary tale so efficiently that after a few years the category is all that most people know. Marion Crawford becomes Crawford. Crawford becomes a verb. The verb means betrayal. The woman who taught a future queen to read, who organised Christmas pantomimes, Wartime Castle, who postponed her own wedding for 16 years and moved to Aberdeen to be near a road the royal motorcade would drive past without stopping, is gone. What remains is a word that the institution uses to warn the next generation of oysters to stay closed. The effectiveness of this strategy has to be acknowledged even as its cruelty is named. It worked. For decades after Marion Crawford's case, the code held with a reliability that it had not quite managed before her. The people inside the palace understood what she had paid. They understood it concretely and personally in a way that abstract principle rarely produces understanding. They did not do what she had done, most of them because they had watched what doing it had cost her. The institution got what it wanted from the punishment. The deterrent functioned. The silence was maintained. Marion Crawford, sitting in Aberdeen, reading about herself in newspapers that described her as a woman who had broken faith with the people she loved, was paying the price for something that was only partly her own decision, and that the institution had chosen to treat as unforgivable regardless of the circumstances. She paid that price every day for 38 years, and the institution paid nothing. This is worth saying clearly, because the standard account tends to treat the royal family's response as a proportionate reaction to a genuine betrayal, as if the punishment and the crime were matched in the way that justice requires. They were not matched. Marion Crawford wrote a book that described two children she loved in terms that were warm and true, and not, by any honest reading, damaging to the people it portrayed. She did this in circumstances that included a husband who pressured her, publishers who altered her manuscript, and used her name without her full understanding of the consequences, and a British government that had itself encouraged the project that produced the book. For this, she was expelled from the circle of people the royal family acknowledged. She was removed from her home. She was denied any private acknowledgement, for the remaining 38 years of her life, that she had ever existed in relation to the people she had served. She attempted suicide. She died in a nursing home. No flowers were sent. The punishment, measured against the act, was not proportionate. It was institutional. And institutional punishment does not aim at proportionality. It aims at completeness, at the total erasure of the person who violated the code, so that the code itself remains intact. Marion Crawford was erased. The code remained intact for a while. The Windsors have long memories and they hold grudges hard. This is true, but even very long memories and very hard grudges cannot hold a code together forever. When the people inside the institution understand, as they understood increasingly in the decades after Marion Crawford's death, that the institution's promises of loyalty and acknowledgement and reward for service have never quite worked the way the institution claimed they did. Marion Crawford understood this. She understood it, finally, from the inside, from the Aberdeen house, from the note she left after her husband died. "The world has passed me by, and I cannot bear those I love to pass me by on the road." She was not writing about a betrayal she had committed. She was writing about a betrayal she had endured. The distinction mattered to her. Whether it ever mattered to the institution that drove her to write it is a question that the institution's silence has answered with characteristic completeness. There is a question that sits underneath everything that happened to Marion Crawford, a question that the standard account never quite asks, because asking it would require the institution to examine something it has never been willing to examine about itself. The question is this: what exactly did the royal family owe Marion Crawford, and did they pay it? The palace's version of events is built on premise that the debt ran only in one direction. Marion Crawford was employed, she was paid, she was given a grace and favour home and a medal and a pension. She had received what the arrangement entitled her to receive, and when she violated the terms of that arrangement, she forfeited the entitlements that remained. The account is clean and contractual, and it treats the relationship between Marion Crawford and the royal family as a transaction, the way you treat any employment relationship when the employment ends badly. But the relationship was not a transaction. It was never a transaction, and the royal family knew this better than anyone, because they had spent 17 years drawing on precisely those elements of the relationship that transactions cannot produce. You cannot transact your way to the kind of loyalty that stays with two frightened children in a castle dungeon while bombs fall on London. You cannot buy the quality of steadiness that keeps a child psychologically intact through an abdication crisis, through a world war, through the complete reorganization of her family's life and her own future, through years of cold and austerity and uncertainty. You cannot hire the specific form of love that Marion Crawford had for Elizabeth and Margaret, the love that made her postpone her own marriage. Not once but repeatedly, not because any contract required it, but because she could not bear the idea of abandoning children who needed her. The royal family had drawn on all of this. They had drawn on it for 17 years. They had drawn on it specifically because it was not transactional, because it was the kind of devotion that could not be costed or replaced or easily replicated. They had said so directly. The king had told her she was irreplaceable. The girls had written her letters that used the language of love, not the language of employment. The institution had accepted and benefited from Marion Crawford's emotional investment in the family she served. And then, when she wrote a book, the institution retreated entirely to the transactional frame. She had been an employee. She had violated the terms. The relationship was over. The warmth that had been real enough to keep her at Windsor through the worst years of the war was not real enough to survive a memoir that described a child pretending to drive horses from her bed. The inconsistency of this was not accidental. The institution needed Marion Crawford to be emotionally invested in the family in order to extract from her the kind of service that money alone could not purchase. And it needed her to be simply an employee when the time came to apply the punishment that would warn everyone else. It needed both things at different times, and it used whichever version of the relationship was most convenient without ever acknowledging the contradiction. Marion Crawford was not the only person this happened to. She was the most visible, because she was the first, and because the punishment in her case was so thorough that it became a reference point for every subsequent case. But the pattern she experienced, the extraction of emotional investment, followed by the retreat to contractual logic when the investment became inconvenient, was not unique to her. It was structural. It was how the institution operated, and it operated that way because it worked. because the people inside it were too close to it to see it clearly until it was too late. Consider what the institution had taken from her beyond the 17 years themselves. It had taken the years of her late 20s and her 30s, during which she might have built a different life. It had taken the possibility of children, not as an abstract potential, but as something specific and real that she had wanted. It had taken the ordinary domestic existence that she had intended for herself when she completed her training at Moray House, the small Edinburgh life that she had given up not through any grand decision, but through the slow accumulation of days in which leaving always seemed more costly than staying. In return for all of this, the institution had given her a medal, a pension she considered inadequate, a cottage that was not hers, a dinner service, 3 bedside lamps, and a coffee set. Then it had taken the cottage back. Then it had made her name a synonym for betrayal. Then it had driven past her house every summer for decades without stopping. Then it had sent nothing when she died. The accounting set out in those terms is not complicated. What is complicated is the question of why it took so long for anyone in a position of authority, inside or outside the institution, to set it out in those terms. Why the palace's version of events held as long as it did. Why Marion Crawford remained, for most of the years between 1950 and her death in 1988, more commonly described as a traitor than as a woman who had been systematically taken advantage of by an institution that had perfected the art of consuming people without acknowledging the consumption. Part of the answer is the institution's media management. The palace in the post-war decades had relationships with newspaper editors and proprietors that were close enough to constitute, in practice, a degree of control over what appeared in print. This did not mean that critical coverage was impossible. It meant that the terms on which stories about the royal family were discussed in the mainstream press tended to reflect the institutional perspective more reliably than they reflected the perspective of people the institution had discarded. Marion Crawford had no press office. She had no relationships with editors. She had, after the Woman's Own column disaster of 1955, no platform at all. The institution had a great deal of all of these things, and it used them. Part of the answer is also more psychological, more human. The British public in the post-war decades had a relationship with the monarchy that was shaped by the war years, by the image of the king and queen standing in the rubble of the East End, by the sense that the royal family had shared the national experience of danger and sacrifice in ways that earlier monarchs had not. This created a reservoir of goodwill and loyalty that made criticism of the institution harder to sustain. A woman who had written a book about the royals without permission was easier to categorize as a betrayer of that goodwill than as a victim of an institution that had consumed her life. And part of the answer, perhaps the most uncomfortable part, is that Marion Crawford herself never mounted a sustained public defense of what she had done. She explained privately to people who would listen. She hoped for reconciliation. She did not fight the palace's version of events with the kind of public, sustained, documented counter-narrative that might have shifted the terms of the conversation. This was partly temperament. She was not, by nature, a fighter in the public sense. She was a woman who had spent 17 years in an institution that rewarded discretion and punished visibility. And those 17 years had shaped her in ways that made a loud, sustained public defense feel wrong, feel like exactly the kind of behavior she had been trained to believe was beneath her. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The institution had trained her to be an oyster, and even when the institution had turned against her, she could not fully stop being what she had been trained to be. This is perhaps the most precise measure of how completely the royal household had shaped her. She had given it her 20s and her 30s and her 40s. She had given it her fertility and her freedom and her ordinary life. And it had given her, in return, a set of values and habits and self-conceptions that made it very difficult for her to fight back effectively, even when fighting back was exactly what her situation required. She sat in Aberdeen and she waited and she hoped. The motorcade drove past. No one stopped. To understand what happened to Marion Crawford, you have to understand the woman who set it in motion. Not the woman the public knew, not the figure in the pastel hats and the warm smile who became one of the most beloved public figures in 20th century Britain. But the woman who existed behind that carefully constructed surface, the woman who wrote in April 1949 that people in positions of confidence must be utterly oyster, the woman who read a warm and affectionate memoir about her own daughters and told Lady Astor that the governess had gone off her head, the woman who, despite knowing exactly how the project that produced the book had come about, despite knowing that the British government had encouraged it, and that her own qualified approval had contributed to Marion Crawford's confusion about what was and was not permitted, chose to treat the book as an unforgivable act of personal betrayal and maintained that position without deviation for the remaining 5 decades of her life. Queen Elizabeth, who would become the Queen Mother after her husband's death in 1952, was one of the most skillfully managed public images of the 20th century. This is not a criticism dressed as a compliment. The management was real, sustained, and extraordinarily effective. She had understood from very early in her public life that the relationship between a royal figure and the public is not a natural relationship. It is a constructed one, and the construction requires constant maintenance, and the maintenance requires that certain things be visible and certain other things remain entirely out of sight. What she made visible was warmth. She was genuinely warm, in the sense that warmth was a real feature of her character in the right circumstances. She was witty. She was charming in the specific sense that the word has when applied to people who have genuinely studied the art of making other people feel noticed and valued. She drank, which the public found endearing in a way that austerity never would have been. She wore impractical colours and feathered hats, and she smiled at crowds, and she shook hands with the kind of focused attention that made each individual recipient feel that they were in that moment the person she most wanted to meet. This was real, and it was also a performance, and the performance was designed, among other things, to make it very difficult for anyone watching it to connect the smiling woman in the pastel hat with the woman who was simultaneously conducting, over decades, one of the most sustained and thorough acts of personal erasure in modern British royal history. She had a capacity for grudge that her public image was careful never to reveal. Her biographer, Ingrid Seward, noted that her attitude toward Edward the Fitty and Wallis Simpson, the two people she held responsible for the abdication that had forced her husband onto a throne he had not wanted, and that she believed had shortened his life, bordered on vendetta. This was not a temporary bitterness that softened with time. It was a position she held and maintained for the rest of her life. Edward Defy died in 1972. Wallis Simpson died in 1986. The Queen Mother outlived them both by years, surviving to 101, and there is no serious historical evidence that her feelings about either of them changed materially in the decades that followed their deaths. She referred to Wallis Simpson consistently and without irony as that woman. The phrase was not casual. It was the vocabulary of someone who had decided, decades earlier, on the precise emotional register she intended to maintain toward a specific human being, and who had never found a reason to revise it. Wallis Simpson, in the Queen Mother's private world, was not a person with a complicated history and understandable motivations. She was that woman, a category, an erasure performed through punctuation and definite article. Marion Crawford was not the first person to be erased by the Queen Mother, and she was not the last. She was, however, the person who experienced the erasure most publicly and most completely, because her erasure was also meant to serve a warning function that the erasures of Wallis Simpson did not need to serve. Wallis Simpson was a public figure who could be publicly disapproved of. Marion Crawford was a servant who had violated the code, and the punishment for violating the code needed to be visible enough to the other servants that they understood what the code required. What makes the Queen Mother's role in the Marion Crawford story particularly worth examining is the question of her own responsibility for the situation that produced the book. Because the Queen Mother was not an innocent bystander who discovered, to her horror, that a trusted servant had decided to sell her story. She was a participant in the sequence of events that led to the book's existence, and her participation was not passive. She had employed Marion Crawford. She had retained her when Marion Crawford attempted to leave on multiple occasions because the family found it inconvenient for her to go. She had accepted the benefits of Marion Crawford's emotional investment in her daughters for 17 years. She had written, in April 1949, a letter that gave Marion Crawford a carefully qualified permission to assist anonymously with the articles the Ladies' Home Journal wanted to publish. She had communicated to Lady Astor her desire to have certain passages removed from the manuscript. She had not communicated any of this directly to Marion Crawford. She had allowed the Goulds, who had their own interests and who were not acting as the Queen Mother's agents, to manage the relationship with Marion Crawford in ways that served the publishers rather than the family. And then, when the book appeared, she had declared that the governess had gone off her head and had never spoken to her again. The phrase itself deserves attention. The governess has gone off her head. It is a phrase that serves several purposes simultaneously. It attributes Marion Crawford's behavior to a kind of mental instability rather than to any rational calculation or understandable motivation. It removes from the Queen Mother any obligation to examine whether her own role in the situation might have contributed to the outcome. It frames what happened as something done to the family by a person who had become unhinged, rather than as something that had emerged from a set of circumstances in which the family bore some share of responsibility. It is also as a characterization of Marion Crawford's state of mind obviously false. Marion Crawford had not gone off her head. She was a woman in a complicated situation, navigating pressures from her husband, from American publishers who held her contract, and from an institution that had given her contradictory signals about what was and was not acceptable. She was not mentally unstable. She was a person whose situation had been made more complicated than it needed to be by decisions that other people had made, and the Queen Mother's preferred explanation for her behavior served the institutional narrative, while doing nothing to engage with the actual facts of the situation. This pattern, the retreat to characterization when engagement with facts would be more accurate but less convenient, was consistent in the Queen Mother's handling of people who had inconvenienced her. It was how she handled Wallis Simpson. It was how she handled the Duke of Windsor, her brother-in-law, who spent decades seeking the kind of formal royal recognition for his wife that the family, led in substantial part by the Queen Mother's implacable opposition, consistently denied. The characterization of people who created difficulties as having somehow failed morally or mentally, rather than as having made choices in complicated situations that the institution had often itself helped to create, was a technique, and it was a technique that worked, because the institution's authority gave its characterizations weight that the individuals on the other side of those characterizations could not easily counter. Marion Crawford could not easily counter being described as having gone off her head, because the phrase was being deployed by the consort of the King of England in private correspondence with Lady Astor, in a context where it would reach the ears of exactly the people who needed to understand the family's position on the matter. It was not a casual diagnosis, it was a signal, and signals of that kind, coming from that source, in that world, carried authority that a Scottish governess living in Aberdeen had no realistic mechanism for challenging. The Queen Mother lived to 101. She died in March 2002, 52 years after The Little Princesses was published. Marion Crawford had been dead for 14 years by then, had died in a nursing home in Aberdeen in February 1988, had died without a reconciliation, without an acknowledgement, without even the small private gesture that a Christmas card would have represented. The Queen Mother never sent one, not in 1950, when the silence was new and the family's anger was at its most acute, not in 1960, when a decade had passed and the acuteness had presumably softened into something more habitual, not in 1970, not in 1977, when Marion Crawford's husband died and she attempted to take her own life, not in any of the years that followed. The Queen Mother maintained the silence with the same consistency that she maintained every other position she adopted toward people who had caused her difficulty. She was 101 years old, and she had outlasted almost everyone who had known her in the years when the story was still fresh, and she had never in 52 years indicated that she regarded the punishment she had authorized as excessive, or the silence she had maintained as anything other than the appropriate response to what Marion Crawford had done. The woman who had turned her charm up to 11 on a young Scottish teacher at Edinburgh's Rosyth docks in 1932, who had persuaded her to come south for a trial month to see If You Like Us and We Like You, who had accepted 17 years of loyalty and service and love and the postponement of an entire life, had, bis 1950, that the terms of the arrangement had been violated, and she had never decided otherwise. The warm smile, the pastel hats, the grandmother of the nation, the woman described by Adolf Hitler with a grudging respect that he rarely extended to anyone as the most dangerous woman in Europe. Both of these were true. They were the same person. The public version and the private version occupied the same body and moved through the same years, and the only people who knew both versions were the people who had been inside the household long enough to see past the performance. Marion Crawford had been inside long enough. She had seen past it. She had written about it with the careful, affectionate restraint of someone who loved the family she described and was not trying to damage them. It had not mattered. The warm smile did not extend to people who had crossed the line, and the line, as Marion Crawford had discovered, was drawn in a place that the institution had never quite made clear until after you had already crossed it. There is a detail in the historical record that tends to be treated as a footnote, and that is, on reflection, anything but. When The Little Princesses was published, and the royal family's reaction hardened into the total silence that would persist for the remaining 38 years of Marion Crawford's life, Princess Elizabeth was described by historians who subsequently examined the correspondence from that period as deeply shocked and hurt and furious. Not merely the Queen Mother, not merely the institution, Elizabeth herself. The woman Marion Crawford had known since she was 6 years old. The woman she had sat beside in a castle dungeon while bombs fell on London. The woman whose love for Philip Mountbatten she had encouraged and protected when the rest of the family was still uncertain. The woman who, on the morning of her wedding at Westminster Abbey, had kissed Crawford goodbye at Nottingham Cottage before leaving for the most significant day of her young life. That woman was deeply shocked and hurt and furious. The shock is understandable. The hurt is understandable. The fury requires more examination, because the fury is the part that reveals something important about the kind of person Princess Elizabeth was and the kind of monarch she was becoming, and the revelation is not entirely comfortable. By any honest reading of The Little Princesses, there is very little in the book that should have shocked or hurt the woman it described. Marion Crawford's portrait of Princess Elizabeth as a child and young woman is almost uniformly admiring. She is presented as serious, dutiful, naturally gifted with the kind of steady attentiveness that distinguished leadership requires. She is shown as kind, as thoughtful, as genuinely interested in the people around her. The book is not a critique. It is a tribute, written by a woman who had spent 17 years observing its subject at close range, and who had come away with a profound respect for what she saw. What it was and what produced the fury was unauthorized. It was a portrait that Elizabeth had not approved and could not control. It said things about her that were true and admiring, and that she would not have been able to say were false. And none of that mattered, because the issue was not the content. The issue was the control. Someone had looked at Elizabeth's private life, the private self that existed beneath the public performance she had been trained since childhood to maintain, and had described it without asking permission. This was the violation, not the warmth, not the affection. The act of looking and describing, of making visible something that the institution had decided should remain opaque. Elizabeth had been raised to understand the distinction between the public and the private self in specific and institutional terms. The public self was the sovereign self, available to the nation, managed through ceremony and protocol and the careful calibration of what was shown and what was withheld. The private self was the sovereign's personal property, protected by the walls of the palace and the loyalty of the people inside those walls, never to be made available to the public, regardless of how benign the making available might appear in any specific instance. Marion Crawford had made the private self available. She had done it kindly and lovingly, and with no apparent desire to damage the people she described. None of that changed what she had done. The distinction between public and private was not a matter of content. It was a matter of principle, and Princess Elizabeth understood institutional principles with the thoroughness of someone who had been trained to embody them since childhood, and who had absorbed them so completely that they had become indistinguishable from personal conviction. She was deeply shocked and hurt and furious, and she sustained that shock and hurt and fury for the remaining 38 years of Marion Crawford's life. She never wrote, she never sent a card, she never, as far as the historical record reveals, made any private gesture toward the woman who had held her hand through the most formative years of her life. This is the aspect of the Marion Crawford story that is hardest to reconcile with the public image of Queen Elizabeth II. The public image, which was carefully maintained, and which was, in its genuine dimensions, accurate, was of a woman of unusual steadiness and composure, a woman who had dedicated her life to service, a woman whose personal feelings were consistently subordinated to her sense of duty. These qualities were real. Elizabeth possessed them in full measure. Marion Crawford herself had observed and described them when Elizabeth was still a child, and they were already visible. What is harder to reconcile is the application of those qualities to the situation of Marion Crawford specifically, because the duty that Elizabeth felt, the sense of institutional obligation that guided her public conduct, was also the instrument of Marion Crawford's erasure. The same quality that made Elizabeth a remarkable sovereign, the capacity to subordinate personal feeling to institutional requirement, was what allowed her to maintain 38 years of silence toward a woman who had loved her. She did not maintain that silence out of cruelty. This distinction matters, though it is difficult and must be stated carefully. Cruelty is intentional. It requires the active desire to cause suffering. The evidence does not support the conclusion that Elizabeth wanted Marion Crawford to suffer. What the evidence supports is something more complicated and in some ways more troubling, that the suffering was simply not the point. Marion Crawford's feelings, her loneliness, her hope for reconciliation, her suicide attempt after her husband's death, her final years in a nursing home, were not factors in Elizabeth's calculation. Not because Elizabeth was indifferent to human suffering in the abstract, but because the institution had determined that Marion Crawford was outside the circle of people whose suffering Elizabeth needed to account for. She was outside because she had violated the code, and violations of the code produced consequences that the institution maintained regardless of the human cost on the other side of those consequences. Elizabeth had been raised inside this framework from infancy. She had not chosen it in any meaningful sense. It was the water she swam in, the architecture of her world, the logic that organized every significant relationship in her life. When the institutions determined that someone was outside the circle, Elizabeth's personal feelings about that person became irrelevant to how the institution responded. Not because her personal feelings did not exist, because the institution did not ask for them. There are people who find this admirable. The argument goes something like this. Elizabeth had made a commitment to an institution that required certain things of her, and she kept that commitment even when it was personally costly. She subordinated her own feelings, her own warmth, her own relationship with a woman she had genuinely loved to the requirements of the role she had accepted. This is, on a certain reading, integrity. It is consistency. It is the application of principle without exception. There are other people who find it horrifying for exactly the same reasons. The same qualities viewed differently produce a different verdict. The capacity to erase a person from your acknowledgement for 38 years because an institution requires it is not a human virtue. It is an institutional one. It is a quality that institutions prize because it makes the people who possess it reliable instruments of institutional will. Whether those same qualities are good for the person who possesses them, whether they represent genuine integrity or the substitution of institutional logic for moral reasoning, is a question that the public image of Elizabeth II was very carefully designed never to raise. Marion Crawford had spent 17 years watching Elizabeth develop these qualities. She had, in her own way, contributed to their development. She had taught Elizabeth that the world outside the palace walls was worth engaging with. She had fought consistently, if quietly, to ensure that the future queen had some exposure to the texture of ordinary human experience. She had believed that this exposure would make Elizabeth a more complete human being and a more compassionate monarch. She was right about the monarch. The Elizabeth who became queen in 1952 and reigned for 70 years was, by the evidence of her public conduct, genuinely at and tip to the human dimensions of the role in ways that earlier monarchs had not always been. She engaged with her subjects with a warmth that was real, not merely performed. She adapted to changing expectations over 7 decades, with more grace than most institutions manage. She was, by most honest assessments, a remarkably good sovereign. Whether she was, in the specific context of her relationship with Marion Crawford, a good person is a different question. And it is a question that the palace's long management of the Marion Crawford story has been designed to prevent people from asking, because asking it requires acknowledging something that the institution finds uncomfortable, that the qualities that made Elizabeth such a reliable sovereign, the capacity to subordinate personal feeling to institutional requirements, the ability to maintain principle without exception, were the same qualities that allowed her to leave a woman who had loved her to spend 38 years in silence and die in a nursing home without a wreath. The qualities are not separable. The steady, principled sovereign and the woman who sent nothing when Marion Crawford died are the same person. The warmth that the public experienced and the silence that Marion Crawford experienced are both genuine expressions of the same character. The institution that produced Elizabeth produced both things simultaneously, and the institution has always been more interested in the public warmth than in the private silence, for obvious reasons. Marion Crawford knew both. She had known Elizabeth since the child was 6 years old. She had seen the warmth before it was a performance, and the principle before it was a public virtue. She had watched both develop over 17 years in the nurseries and the schoolrooms and the dungeon shelters of Windsor Castle, and she had believed, with the particular faith of someone who has known a person before the world has finished making them, that the warmth was stronger than the principle. She was wrong about this, not because the warmth was fake, but because the principle in Elizabeth ran deeper than Marion Crawford had understood, deeper perhaps than Elizabeth herself had understood, until the moment the institution required her to apply it. The letters Marion Crawford kept, the warm personal correspondence from Princess Elizabeth that she had preserved as evidence of the relationship's reality, and that she refused, even after the silence began, to use in her own defense, because she considered using them a further violation of the privacy she had already been accused of violating. Those letters showed that the warmth was real. They did not show that the warmth was durable against the requirements of the institution. Nothing was in the end durable against that. Every account of Marion Crawford's story eventually arrives at George Buthley. He is the figure who divides opinion most sharply among the people who have examined the case carefully. The palace's version placed him at the center of the betrayal, presenting him as the primary agent of Marion Crawford's downfall. The man who pressured his wife into a decision she would not have made alone, and who managed the contract with the American publishers in ways that served his own interests more reliably than hers. Some historians who have looked at the evidence sympathetically toward Marion Crawford have arrived at similar conclusions, casting Buthley as the villain of the piece, the bad actor whose interference turned a complicated situation into a catastrophic one. Neither assessment is entirely wrong. Both are incomplete. George Buthley was a Scottish bank manager from Aberdeen, 16 years older than Marion Crawford, a divorced man with a complicated personal history. The charitable description of him, offered by people who examined his role with some care, was that he was a man who understood the financial value of his wife's royal connections and was not inhibited by the same institutional loyalties that made Marion Crawford hesitate. The less charitable description, offered by multiple sources, including the slightly foxed Literary Review's assessment of the period, was that he was a philanderer with a dodgy war record of smuggling who saw in his wife's years of palace service an asset to be converted into cash. Both of these things can be simultaneously true of the same person. They were, in all likelihood, simultaneously true of George Buthley. What is clear from the historical record is that Buthley moved faster and with less regard for consequence than the situation warranted. He made contact with the Goulds on Marion Crawford's behalf. He signed the contract. The contract contained the clause, vague by design or by carelessness, that allowed publication under Marion Crawford's name without the consent of the royal family. Butler boasted of his royal connections in his business transactions. He had Marion Crawford ask the royal family to transfer their banking businesses to Drummond's Bank, the institution for which he worked, a request that was both presumptuous and revealing of the degree to which he regarded her proximity to the palace as a resource he was entitled to draw on. There is also the question of what Marion Crawford understood about the contract before she signed it. Multiple researchers who have examined this period have concluded that she may not have read the contract thoroughly before it was signed, that Butler's management of the process was fast enough that she was not fully aware of the terms, particularly the clause about publication under her name, before those terms were already binding. One author who studied the case closely stated that she believed Butler had made sure his wife did not see or read the contract before she signed it. Whether this is correct is not provable from the existing record. What is clear is that Marion Crawford subsequently expressed genuine surprise and concern about the way her name was being used, and that her expressions of concern were not consistent with the behavior of someone who had knowingly agreed to the terms that the contract contained. The palace, which had its own reasons for presenting Marion Crawford as a calculating agent of her own downfall, rather than as a woman who had been partially managed into a situation by a husband whose interests were not identical to hers, had no interest in examining the nuances of the Butler question. It was simpler and more useful for the deterrent function the punishment was meant to serve, to present Marion Crawford as a person who had made a choice. Choices can be condemned. Complicated situations involving contractual misunderstanding, a pressuring husband, and the British government's own involvement in the project that produced the book are harder to condemn and harder to use as warnings to the next generation of palace staff. So the palace's version elided the complications and produced a clean story. Disloyal servant, book, punishment. Marion Crawford's name became a verb. The nuances stayed buried, but Butler's role, whatever its precise dimensions, does not exonerate the palace any more than it exonerates Marion Crawford. Because even if Butler was the primary architect of the contract that produced the book, the underlying conditions that made the book possible, the 17 years of service, the inadequate pension, the grace and favour home that was not really hers, the wedding presents that were an insult to anyone who had spent 16 years postponing their marriage on the family's behalf, those conditions were the palace's creation. Butler did not force Marion Crawford to give the best years of life to an institution that rewarded her inadequately. He did not make the Queen Mother ask her to stay when she tried to leave. He did not design the system that extracted emotional investment from people while treating them contractually as simple employees. He found a woman who had legitimate grievances and used those grievances as leverage. That is not admirable, but the grievances were real before he touched them, and they were created by the institution, not by George Butler. There is another dimension to the Butler question that tends to receive less attention than his role in the book deal. He was Marion Crawford's husband. She had waited 16 years to marry him, had held the relationship together through the war years and the restrictions of palace service, had believed in him, or at least in the idea of the life they would build together, enough to postpone it for long enough that by the time she was permitted to live it, significant parts of it were no longer available to her. What kind of husband he actually was is a matter on which the historical record is less generous than Marion Crawford's long patience might suggest he deserved. He was described by one source as an alcoholic and a womanizer. He used her royal connections for his own professional advancement without apparent concern for what that use might cost her. He pushed her toward the book deal and managed the contract in ways that served the financial outcome rather than her relationship with the family she had served. He died in 1977, and she attempted suicide in the months that followed, and the note she left suggests that his death removed the last remaining buffer between her and the full weight of the isolation she had lived inside since 1950. She had waited 16 years for this man. She had given up the possibility of children, had endured years of institutional postponement, had stayed in a castle in wartime because the family found it inconvenient for her to go, and had done all of this partly because there was a man in Aberdeen who was waiting for her, and who represented the ordinary life she intended to live when the palace was finally finished with her. The man turned out to be complicated in ways that her patience did not deserve and her situation could not absorb. The ordinary life turned out to be more expensive than she had expected, and the family for whom she had sacrificed it turned out to be less capable of loyalty than she had believed. The triangle of the palace, Marion Crawford and George Buthley, is at its core a story about the consequences of being caught between competing demands from people and institutions who each wanted more from her than they were prepared to give in return. The palace wanted her labour and her silence. Buthley wanted her name and her access. Neither of them was particularly interested in what she wanted, which was straightforwardly human and straightforwardly reasonable. Recognition, security, the acknowledgement that 17 years of service to an institution that had consumed her best years entitled her to something more than a coffee set and 3 bedside lamps. She did not get the recognition. She did not get the security in any durable form. She got the money from the book, and the money was real, but the money came with consequences that lasted 38 years. She got a husband who died a decade before she did, and whose death broke whatever remained of her capacity to absorb the silence she had been living in since 1950. Nigel Estelle, her close friend and confidant in the Aberdeen years, said it plainly after her death. She always hoped for a reconciliation. It never came. She was intensely loyal. She had letters from the palace that proved she had been acting in good faith. She would not use them. Using them would have required her to do again, in public, the very thing she had been condemned for doing in the first place, making visible something that the palace had determined should remain private. She had the letters, she held them, she died holding them. The loyalty she had given the palace for 17 years, the loyalty she had been condemned for supposedly violating, she gave again in Aberdeen for 38 more years. She kept its secrets, she protected its private correspondence. She refused to defend herself in ways that might have damaged the people she was defending herself against. Because even after everything the institution had done to her, she could not bring herself to be the thing it had already decided she was. The institution had called her a traitor. She spent the rest of her life proving it wrong, privately, in ways that no one in the palace ever acknowledged or thanked her for. George Buthley had pushed her toward the book. The palace had punished her for it. She had kept faith with both of them, in different ways and for different reasons, long after either of them had given her any particular reason to. This is not the story of a woman who sold her story. It is the story of a woman who could not quite stop being loyal to the people she had loved, even when those people had made very clear that the loyalty was no longer welcome, required, or reciprocated. The palace built its version of Marion Crawford out of the worst interpretation of everything she did. Her letters, her hope for reconciliation, her refusal to use the private correspondence to defend herself, her 38 years of silence in Aberdeen, none of this appeared in the palace's version. None of it fitted the category the palace had created for her. Categories are not built to accommodate contradictions. Marion Crawford was full of contradictions. She was a progressive-minded educator who had given her life to the most conservative institution in Britain. She was a woman who believed in the importance of freedom and normal experience, who had confined herself to a palace for 17 years. She was a person who had been called a traitor, who spent the rest of her life behaving, in the ways that mattered most, like the most loyal person in the room. She had waited 16 years for George Buthley. She had waited 38 years for the palace. In both cases, what she was waiting for never came. Marion Crawford died in February 1988. By that point, she had been gone from the royal household for 39 years. The girls she had raised were 61 and 57 years old. Princess Elizabeth had been queen for 36 years. The world Marion Crawford had entered as a 22-year-old teacher from Gateshead in East Ayrshire had changed in almost every dimension that a world can change in. Television had arrived, the empire had dissolved, the war generation was aging. Britain was a different country in almost every meaningful sense from the Britain that had existed when she first walked through the door of the Duke and Duchess of York's household in 1933. The royal family had changed too, or at least had changed in certain surface respects. It had adapted to television. It had learned to manage a media environment that was more intrusive and more difficult to control than the one Marion Crawford had navigated in the 1930s and 1940s. It had watched its private lives become increasingly public in ways that the institution had fought and failed to prevent, and it had developed, over the decades, new mechanisms for managing that publicity, new strategies for controlling what reached the public and what did not. What had not changed, in any dimension that the Marion Crawford story illuminates, was the fundamental relationship between the institution and the people who served it. The logic was the same in 1988 as it had been in 1950. The institution extracted loyalty, emotional investment, years of life. It rewarded that investment adequately enough to maintain the arrangement, but not generously enough to create genuine security. It treated the people inside it as indispensable right up until the moment it decided they were dispensable, and then it made the dispensability total and permanent. It maintained a code of silence that operated not through legal enforcement, but through the internalization of values, and when the code was violated, it punished the violation in ways that were designed to function as warnings to everyone who came after. This pattern did not end with Marion Crawford. She was the first clear case, the one that established the template. The cases that followed her confirmed it. Diana was not a servant. She was a member of the family, which should in principle have made her position different. In practice, the institution treated her departure from its preferred version of events with the same mechanisms it had deployed against Marion Crawford, the same retreat to characterization, the same management of the public narrative, the same mobilization of the institutional apparatus against a person who had made the private visible without authorization. The scale was different. The stakes were higher. The public response was different in ways that no one inside the palace had predicted. But the underlying logic was the same. The institution required loyalty. The loyalty was violated. The institution responded with the tools available to it. Paul Burrell published his memoir in 2003. William and Harry called it a cold and overt betrayal. The language was almost exactly the same as the language the palace had used about Marion Crawford half a century earlier. The institution had a consistent vocabulary for people who violated the code. The vocabulary did not examine the circumstances of the violation. It condemned the violation in terms that were designed to end the conversation rather than open it. Harry published his own memoir in 2023 and experienced his own version of the institutional response: the withdrawal of formal status, the loss of the grace and favour residences, the sustained public pressure applied through the mechanisms the institution had available. He was a member of the family rather than a servant, which meant the specific tools available were different, but the underlying dynamic was recognizable. The institution had determined that a line had been crossed. The institution applied consequences. The institution maintained its version of events. What the Marion Crawford case reveals, examined from a distance of 70 years, is not primarily a story about a disloyal governess or even a story about one woman's treatment by one family. It is a case study in how very powerful institutions manage the people who know too much about them. The management strategy has several consistent components, and those components have been remarkably stable across the decades that separate Marion Crawford from the cases that followed her. The first component is the extraction of emotional investment. The institution identifies people who can provide more than contractual service, people who will bring their genuine selves to the work, who will love the people they serve, who will make sacrifices that no contract can compel. It cultivates that emotional investment because it makes the service better and the people providing it more reliable. Marion Crawford was not unusual in this respect. The palace has always been good at finding people who want to belong to something larger than themselves and offering them the experience of belonging, temporarily and conditionally, to the largest and most historically significant household in Britain. The second component is the conditional nature of the belonging. The emotional investment is welcomed and cultivated right up until it becomes inconvenient. The moment the person acts in ways that the institution has not authorized, the belonging is withdrawn. Not gradually, not with warning, not with the kind of conversation that one human being owes another after 17 years of shared life. Immediately and totally, the warmth is switched off. The person discovers that what felt like genuine inclusion was inclusion on terms that were never made explicit, because making them explicit would have required the institution to acknowledge that the terms existed. The third component is the narrative management. The institution is good at stories, and it tells its stories first and loudest. Marion Crawford becomes Crawfy. Crawfy becomes a verb. The verb means betrayal. The full story, with its government involvement and its contractual complications and its inadequate pension and its coffee set, never quite reaches the public with the same force as the simple story of a disloyal servant who sold her story. Simple stories are more durable than complicated ones. The palace knows this and has always known it. The fourth component is the silence. The silence serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It punishes the person who violated the code. It prevents any further exchange of information that might complicate the institutional narrative. It demonstrates to everyone else inside the institution what the consequences of violation look like, and it maintains over time the particular advantage that institutions have over individuals. The institution outlasts them. The institution can sustain a silence for 38 years without effort, because institutions do not experience time the way individuals do. Marion Crawford experienced every one of those 38 years. The institution simply continued. The fifth component is the absence of accountability. No one inside the palace ever examined, in any serious or public way, whether the treatment of Marion Crawford was proportionate to what she had done. The institution's version of events, once established, was not subject to revision. No member of the royal family ever suggested, even privately, that the punishment might have been excessive or the circumstances more complicated than the public account allowed. The code required that the punishment be maintained, and the code was maintained, and no one who mattered inside the institution found it necessary to raise the question of whether the code was just. This is not unique to the British royal family. It is a feature of institutions in general, and very powerful institutions in particular. What makes the royal family's version of this pattern distinctive is the degree to which it has been obscured by the performance of warmth. The pastel hats and the warm smiles and the decades of public goodwill have created, around the institution, a protective layer of positive feeling that makes it very difficult to look clearly at what happens to the people inside it when the institution decides it is finished with them. Marion Crawford was inside it for 17 years. She gave it the best years of her life, not as a figure of speech, but as a literal description of what the 17 years from 22 to 38 represent in a person's life. She delayed her marriage. She lived through a war. She raised a future queen. She organized Christmas pantomimes in castle dungeons so that two frightened children could feel that life was still worth something. And then the institution was finished with her, and it applied to her the same mechanism it had always applied to people it was finished with. And she spent 38 years in Aberdeen, hoping for a letter that never came, watching a motorcade pass without stopping, and dying in a nursing home in February 1988, without a wreath from the people she had loved. The institution did not change because of what it did to her. It simply continued. It would do similar things to similar people in the decades that followed, with different details and different specific consequences, but the same underlying logic. Marion Crawford was the first, the one who established what the pattern looked like from the inside, the one whose name became a verb, whose story became a warning, whose 38 years of subsequent life were converted by the institution into a category that made it easier to dismiss her than to understand what had actually happened to her. She had hoped, right until the end, that the truth would come out. Her friend Nigel Estelle said it clearly after her death. She always hoped for a reconciliation. She wanted the truth to be known. She was intensely loyal. She would not use the letters to defend herself, even though those letters proved she had been acting in good faith. The letters proved it. She kept them. She died holding them. The truth she wanted out was not complicated. It was this: she had loved two children and raised them as well as she knew how. She had stayed when she wanted to leave because they needed her. She had written about them with warmth and honesty and no intention to harm them. She had been caught in a situation partly of her husband's making and partly of the institution's making, and had been punished for it as if she had designed it herself. She had not defended herself publicly, even when defending herself publicly would have been entirely justified, because she could not bring herself to damage the people she was defending herself against. She had been, in all the ways that the institution claimed to value, utterly loyal. She had simply made the mistake of believing that the loyalty ran in both directions. It did not. It had never been designed to. The institution takes loyalty. It does not, as a structural matter, return it. Marion Crawford learned this at 39 years old, when she did not receive a Christmas card. She spent the next 38 years unlearning the belief that had kept her in the palace for 17 years. The belief that loving an institution and the people inside it was enough to make the institution love you back. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. And the motorcade drove past, and the road was empty again, and Marion Crawford went back inside. 75 years have passed since The Little Princesses was published. The scandal it generated, the fury it provoked, the punishment it brought down on the woman who wrote it, these have all acquired the weight of historical fact. They have been repeated so many times, in so many contexts, that they have come to feel like the natural and inevitable response to a document that must have been, given the reaction, genuinely damaging. It was not genuinely damaging. This is worth establishing with some precision, because the gap between what the book actually contained and what the palace's reaction implied it contained is one of the more revealing features of the entire story. Read today, The Little Princesses is a remarkably gentle document. It is affectionate in ways that read as sincere rather than performed. It is respectful of the people it describes to a degree that could, in certain passages, be described as reverential. It was called, by one reviewer writing from a position of knowledge and professional, standing in the field of royal biography, affectionate, bland and inoffensive, very different from the royal memoirs of today. It has been described by multiple people who have examined it carefully as the kind of account that a devoted member of the household might write in order to show the world that the family she had served was warm and human and worthy of admiration. What it revealed about Princess Elizabeth was, in summary, that she was a serious, dutiful child with a natural aptitude for the responsibilities that would eventually fall to her, that she was kind to animals, particularly horses, that she had a gift for attentiveness that made the adults around her feel genuinely listened to, that she was, in the way that some children are, already more fully formed in certain respects than the environment she inhabited would have suggested was possible. What it revealed about Princess Margaret was that she was brilliant and funny and electric and difficult, that she had a gift for mimicry that the adults around her found both impressive and occasionally alarming, that she was the kind of child who required more management than her sister, precisely because she had more of everything, more energy, more wit, more restlessness, more need for an audience. What it revealed about King George VI was that he had moods, that he was not always easy to be around, that the weight of the role he had not wanted to occupy had affected his temperament in ways that were visible to the people who lived in daily proximity to him. This was the passage the Queen Mother found most troubling by the account of people who subsequently examined her annotations on the manuscript. It was also, by any honest historical assessment, a characterization that was accurate, that was known to people who had observed the king at close range, and that was not inconsistent with the broader historical record of a man who struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, and the demands of a role that had been forced upon him by his brother's abdication. What it revealed about the Queen Mother was that she had a complicated relationship with Wallis Simpson, that she could be imperious with the household staff, that she occasionally interrupted lessons to take the children outside when Marion Crawford felt the lesson required completion, and that she had told Marion Crawford on multiple occasions when Marion Crawford had raised the question of leaving, that it was not a convenient time for her to go. None of this is damaging. None of this is the kind of material that produces scandal in any honest reading of the word. The book described children biting their nails. It described Princess Elizabeth tipping a silver ink pot over her head during a French lesson. It described the family's routine at Balmoral and their habits at Windsor, and the way the abdication crisis affected the daily life of two small girls who were too young to understand why their parents were suddenly so burdened and worried. It described a family Not a perfect family, and not a performing family, but a real one, with the ordinary dimensions and the ordinary tensions and the ordinary small failures that families have when they are not performing for a public audience. It described them with love. The love was on every page and in every anecdote, and readers who approached it without the context of the scandal felt it and responded to it. The book sold enormously because people who read it came away feeling that they had been given access to something warm and human about people who otherwise existed at an untouchable distance. That was, from the palace's perspective, precisely the problem. The palace had not decided that the family was not warm and human. The palace had decided that the warmth and humanity were assets to be managed and deployed on the palace's terms, not described and made available without authorization. The distinction between a warm and human royal family and a warm and human royal family that has chosen to reveal itself is, in the palace's management of its public image, not a trivial distinction. It is the entire thing. Control of the disclosure is what the palace valued, not the content of the disclosure. The content of the little princesses was, in the palace's own implicit assessment, not actually damaging. It was the loss of control that was unacceptable. This is why the palace's response to the book was disproportionate by any measure that takes content seriously. You cannot read The Little Princesses in good faith and conclude that it justified 38 years of total silence and a funeral attended by none of the people it described. You can read it and conclude that it violated a principle. The principle that the palace controlled what was disclosed, when, and in what form. That principle was real, and the palace took it seriously. But the punishment was calibrated to the violation of the principle, not to any actual harm done to the people the book described. Here is the irony that sits at the center of the story, and that the palace's version has always been careful to suppress. The Little Princesses was, in the deepest sense, an act of royal propaganda. It presented the family in terms that were so favorable, so warm, so carefully stripped of anything that could genuinely embarrass anyone, that it reads now the kind of account the palace might have commissioned itself if it had decided that the time was right for this kind of gentle humanization. The public appetite for the book, on both sides of the Atlantic, was an appetite for exactly the warmth and accessibility that the palace's own communication strategy had always denied the public while simultaneously relying on its effects. Marion Crawford gave the public what the palace would not. She gave them a family, imperfect, real, recognizably human, described with the specificity that only comes from daily proximity over 17 years. She gave them Princess Elizabeth, pretending to drive horses from her bed. She gave them Princess Margaret, performing her brilliant, dangerous mimicry in the corridors of Buckingham Palace. She gave them the castle dungeons converted into air raid shelters, and the crown jewels stored in hat boxes, and the king saying, quietly, in the war years, that the household could not carry on without the woman who kept his daughters steady. These are not secrets, they are not weapons, they are memories, specific and human and true, and they belong, in any honest moral accounting, as much to the woman who lived them as to the institution that has spent 75 years insisting they were its exclusive property. The book was reprinted in 2020. It was reprinted because there is still an audience for it, because the material Marion Crawford wrote about remains of genuine historical interest, because the childhood of Queen Elizabeth II is a subject that readers on both sides of the Atlantic continue to find worth examining, and because the document Marion Crawford produced is, as multiple historians have noted since its original publication, genuinely valuable as a social history of a period and a household that would otherwise have left very little accessible record of its daily life. The reprinting is, in its small way, a form of vindication, not the kind of vindication Marion Crawford hoped for. She hoped for a Christmas card, she hoped for a letter, she hoped for a knock at the door of the Aberdeen house, for someone to stop the car on the Balmoral Road and walk up the path and say, simply, that they understood what had happened, that they knew it was more complicated than the public version, that 17 years deserved something more than 38 years of silence. None of that came. What came, decades after her death, was the historical reassessment that her friend Nigel Estelle had hoped for, the recognition, slowly accumulated through the work of researchers and biographers and novelists, who took her story seriously, that the woman the palace had made into a cautionary tale was actually something quite different. A woman who had given everything to an institution that gave back inadequate compensation and a cottage that was not hers. A woman who had written a book that was, by any honest reading, an act of love. A woman who had spent the remaining decades of her life hoping for an acknowledgement that the institution had decided she did not deserve. The book, the one that destroyed her life in the institutional sense, is still in print. It is still being read. It is still in the assessment of people who know something about the history of the British monarchy and the documents that illuminate it. One of the more valuable accounts of a period and a family that would otherwise be significantly more opaque. Marion Crawford wrote it from memory, with the specific, textured recollection of someone who had been there for every significant moment across 17 years. She wrote it with love for the people she described. She wrote it at a moment when she was not entirely in control of the process, when a husband with his own motivations was managing a contract she may not have fully read, when the Goulds were making decisions about her name and her copy that served their interests rather than hers. She wrote it, despite all of this, and it was good. It was warm and specific and true in the ways that the most honest writing is true, and it gave the world something that the palace had always intended to withhold, which was the simple human reality of the people behind the performance. The palace called this betrayal. 75 years of readers have called it something closer to a gift. In August 2020, a novelist named Wendy Holden published a piece in the Daily Telegraph that opened with a description that readers were clearly meant to find familiar. A sparky career girl from an ordinary background catapulted into the heart of the royal family. Progressive ideas brought along for the ride. The work of dragging the Windsors into the modern age. Trouble. A best-selling book. And then, for the woman at the centre of it, consequences. Holden made the comparison explicit. She was not writing about Meghan Markle. She was writing about Marion Crawford. But the parallel she was drawing was clear, and it was not accidental, and it was not shallow. There is a line that runs from Marion Crawford in 1950 to the cases that followed her, and the line is not a series of coincidences. It is a pattern, and the pattern has a logic, and the logic belongs to the institution rather than to any of the individuals who have found themselves caught inside it. Marion Crawford was the first person in the modern family to discover what the institution did to people who made the visible without authorization. She was not the last. The line that runs from her case forward includes names that became famous for exactly the same reason she did. They were inside the circle. They knew things the institution preferred the public not to know. They made those things visible. And the institution responded with the particular combination and personal erasure that it had developed over centuries and refined in the decades after. Marion Crawford established what the consequences looked like. Wallis Simpson did not work for the royal family. She was the woman who married the man who had been king, and the institution treated her for the remaining decades of her life with a sustained, deliberate exclusion that the Queen Mother maintained personally and vocally until the end. That woman was the phrase the Queen Mother used, not her name. Not even the title that marriage to a former king entitled her to claim in ordinary social contexts. A category. An erasure through grammar. The same mechanism deployed against Marion Crawford, deployed differently toward a different person, for different specific reasons, but with the same underlying logic. This person has crossed a line. This person no longer exists within the circle of people the institution acknowledges. Diana was not a servant and was not an outsider. She was a princess, later a queen-in-waiting, and eventually the most famous woman on the planet. The institution could not apply to her the same mechanisms it had applied to Marion Crawford, because Diana's public visibility was too great and her public support was too strong for simple erasure to work. What it applied instead was a subtler version of the same strategy: the management of narrative, the cultivation of alternative sources, the careful placement of information that complicated her version of events and supported the institutions. It worked for a while. And then it stopped working, because Diana was too visible and too determined and too skilled at the kind of direct communication with the public that the palace had always controlled, and she was refusing to let it control. She gave her Panorama interview in 1995. She told Martin Bashir that there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The institution could not erase a woman who spoke directly to 15 million viewers. The comparison the Daily Telegraph made between Marion Crawford and Meghan Markle is instructive precisely because the 2 women are in many ways quite different. Marion Crawford was a servant. Meghan Markle was a member of the family. Marion Crawford's access to the institution was professional. Meghan Markle's was marital. Marion Crawford came from working-class Scotland with a professional qualification and a specific vocational goal. Meghan Markle came from California with an acting career and a public profile that the institution had not fully reckoned with before the wedding. What they share is not biography. What they share is position. Both were inside the institution long enough to see how it worked from the inside. Both did things the institution had not authorized. Both discovered that the institution's response to unauthorized action was swift, total, and accompanied by a narrative that placed the blame for the situation entirely on the person who had violated the code, rather than examining any part the institution might play in creating the conditions that produced the violation. Marion Crawford was told her name could not appear on the material she contributed. Her name appeared. The institution called this betrayal and never examined what role the Goulds' contract had played in making it happen. Meghan Markle gave an interview to Oprah Winfrey, in which she described the experience of being inside the institution as damaging to her mental health, and described specific interactions that had left her feeling unsupported and afraid. The institution disputed her account, called it hurtful and inaccurate, and the people inside it have not, as far as the public record shows, engaged seriously with the substance of what she described. The mechanism is the same. The institution tells its story first. The institution tells it with the authority that comes from centuries of public trust and institutional weight. The individual on the other side of the story tells their version and finds that it requires much more effort to achieve the same traction, because the individual is one person and the institution is one of the most durable and carefully managed public entities in the world. Prince Harry's memoir, published in 2023, is the most detailed account any person has ever produced of what it feels like to be inside the institution and to find that the institution's interests and your own interests are not aligned. It is a book that Marion Crawford would have recognized in certain of its essential emotional dimensions, even though the specific circumstances are entirely different. The experience of believing yourself to be part of something, of having given something of yourself to an institution that welcomed that giving, and of then discovering that the institution's welcome was conditional in ways you had not understood until the conditions were violated. That experience runs through Harry's account in ways that are not dissimilar to the experience Marion Crawford described, more quietly and with less directness, in The Little Princesses. The institution has consistently responded to these accounts by focusing on the fact of the telling rather than the substance of what is told. Marion Crawford told. Crawfy is now a verb meaning betrayal. The substance of what she told, which was warm and admiring and historically valuable, is not part of the verb. Harry told. The institution's response focused on the telling, on the characterization of the telling as a cold and overt betrayal, on the family's hurt feelings and the damage done to the institution. The substance of what Harry described, the specific experiences and conversations and institutional pressures that he documented, has received considerably less serious engagement from the people he described than it has from historians and commentators who have no institutional interest in dismissing it. The pattern is this. The institution extracts loyalty and service and emotional investment from people it requires. When those people make the private visible without authorization, the institution responds by focusing entirely on the act of disclosure and not at all on what the disclosure reveals about the institution itself. The disclosure is the story. The person who disclosed is the villain. What was disclosed and what it suggests about the conditions that produced it is not examined. Marion Crawford disclosed a family that was warm and human. Harry disclosed a family that was sometimes cold and institutional. Diana disclosed a marriage that had broken down and a family that had not supported her in its breaking. Meghan disclosed an experience of institutional racism and insufficient pastoral care in a moment of personal crisis. The institution's response to all of them was structurally identical. The form of the response shifted with the decades and with the specific stakes involved. The logic behind it did not. This is what 75 years of cases, beginning with Marion Crawford in 1950, looks like when you set them alongside each other. Not a series of individual betrayals by individual people who chose self-interest over loyalty. A recurring structural situation in which the institution creates conditions that people find difficult or impossible to sustain, in which the people inside those conditions eventually reach a point where they do something the institution has not authorized, and in which the institution responds by converting the person who reached that point into a cautionary tale, rather than examining the conditions that produced the situation. Marion Crawford was the cautionary tale that the institution hoped would prevent the next case. The next case came anyway, and the one after that, and the one after that. The institution learned from each case. It introduced formal confidentiality agreements after the early cases had demonstrated that the unwritten code was not reliably enforceable. It refined its media management strategies after Diana demonstrated that a sufficiently visible individual could reach the public directly in ways the palace could not fully control. It developed more sophisticated communications operations to manage the narrative around cases like Harry and Meghan. What it did not do, at any point in those 75 years, was look seriously at the conditions it created for the people inside it, and ask whether those conditions were producing outcomes that were, in any honest moral accounting, defensible. Marion Crawford sat in Aberdeen for 38 years, and the institution did not ask. Diana spent her final years navigating an institution that had made clear it was finished with her, and the institution did not ask. Harry and Meghan left for California, and the institution's response was to manage the departure, not to examine what had produced it. The institution does not ask. That is not what institutions do. What institutions do is continue. They outlast the individuals inside them. They apply the mechanisms available to them. They maintain the code. They drive past the house on the Balmoral Road without stopping. Marion Crawford understood all of this, in the end, from the inside of a nursing home in Aberdeen, in the last years of a life that the institution had shaped more thoroughly than she had understood, when she was young and idealistic, and walking through the door of the household of the Duke and Duchess of York, with plans for a different life entirely. She was not, in the end, the villain of the story the palace told about her. She was a woman who had been used by an institution that was very good at using people, who had loved people inside that institution genuinely and at great personal cost, who had written about them with warmth that they converted into betrayal, and who had spent the remaining decades of her life waiting for an acknowledgement that the institution had decided she was not entitled to receive. She was not the villain, she was the first, and the first is always the one who pays the most, because the first is the one who does not know yet what the institution does to people who cross the line, and the first is the one whose punishment is designed not merely to punish but to warn everyone who comes after, and the first is the one whose name gets turned into a verb. Doing a crawfie. The phrase has been in use for 75 years. The palace intended it as a warning. What it actually is, examined from the right distance, is a description of what the institution does to people, not a description of what those people do to the institution. Marion Crawford did not do a crawfie to the royal family. The royal family did a crawfie to her. In the year 2000, 12 years after Marion Crawford died, in a nursing home in Aberdeen, a box of letters and legal papers surfaced. The papers had been held by her solicitor since her death. They had not been destroyed. They had not been lost. They had been waiting, with the patience of documents that have no urgency of their own, but contain urgency for the people named in them, for the moment when the people those documents implicated were no longer alive and no longer in a position to apply pressure to prevent their release. The Queen Mother was 100 years old in 2000. She died in 2002. The Channel 4 documentary that examined these papers, broadcast in 2000 under the title The Nanny Who Wouldn't Keep Mum, produced a portrait of the Queen Mother that was described by the Observer newspaper in terms that the palace's long management of the Marion Crawford story had never permitted before. The Observer used the word ruthless. It used the word unforgiving. It described the documents as revealing a woman whose publicly constructed image of warmth and benevolence was accompanied, in private, by a capacity for sustained and deliberate cruelty toward a person who had served her family for 17 years. The papers confirmed several things that the palace had preferred remain unexamined. They confirmed that the Queen Mother had been aware of the government's plan to use Marion Crawford as a source for the American magazine articles long before the articles appeared. The documents showed that the project had not emerged solely from Marion Crawford's initiative or her husband's ambition. It had been encouraged by the British government, which saw in it an opportunity to generate favourable coverage of the royal family in the American press. The Queen Mother had known about the project. She had been involved in discussions about it. Her subsequent presentation of herself as a wholly innocent party, shocked by a trusted servant's unilateral decision to sell royal secrets, was not an accurate description of the situation. The papers also showed the full text of the Queen Mother's letter to Marion Crawford from April 1949, the one containing the phrase "utterly oyster." This letter had been known about. What the papers revealed more clearly was the context around it, that the Queen Mother had simultaneously told Marion Crawford not to write and sign articles, and told her that helping the designated writer anonymously would be quite all right as long as her name did not appear. The contradiction between these two positions, the absolute prohibition on one hand and the qualified permission on the other, was now documented rather than reconstructed from memory. It was there in black and white, in the Queen Mother's own hand, and it confirmed what multiple researchers had concluded from examining the available evidence: that Marion Crawford had received contradictory instructions and had been punished for the contradiction as if she had received only the prohibition. The papers showed the Gould's contract, or at least documents related to it, and confirmed the clause that allowed publication under Marion Crawford's name without the consent of the royal family. They confirmed that this clause had been in a contract signed on Marion Crawford's behalf by George Buthley, and that the question of whether Marion Crawford had read and understood the clause before signing was, at minimum, not one that the surviving record answered with clarity in the palace's favour. And the papers contained something else, something that Nigel Estelle, Marion Crawford's close friend and confidant, had known about for years and had waited, through all the years of her life and the years after her death, to see acknowledged. The letters, the private letters from Princess Elizabeth and from the royal family that Marion Crawford had kept throughout her years in Aberdeen. Letters that showed the warmth of the relationship, and letters that showed she had been acting in good faith in the period surrounding the book's production. Letters that she had refused to use to defend herself, even when using them would have been entirely justified and might have shifted public understanding of the case. She had kept those letters. She had kept them through 38 years of silence and isolation and the slow deterioration of everything the institution had promised her. She had kept them through her husband's death and her suicide attempt and her final years in a nursing home. She had kept them because they were evidence that the relationship had been real, that the warmth had been genuine, that the institutional version of events was not the whole truth. She had kept them, and she had not used them. This is perhaps the most complete proof available of where Marion Crawford's loyalty actually lay. Not with the publishers who had used her name, not with her husband who had managed the contract, not with the British government that had encouraged the project, with the family that had refused to speak to her for 38 years. She had documentary evidence that could have complicated the palace's version of events, and she had chosen, year after year, not to use it, because using it would have required her to expose private correspondence in ways that the institution would have found objectionable, and she could not bring herself to do to the palace, again, the very thing the palace had already condemned her for doing once. The documents released in 2000 told part of the story that Marion Crawford had wanted told. Nigel Estelle said it clearly when the documentary aired. She always hoped the truth would come out. That is what Crawford wanted. She loved Elizabeth and Margaret and could never quite believe what happened to her. She could never quite believe it. This detail, quiet and unspectacular in the way that the most important details often are, is the one that sits most heavily in the record of her final years. Not that she was angry, not that she had been converted by the experience into a bitter and cynical person who had abandoned her belief in the family she had served. She had never quite been able to believe what they had done. The love she felt for Elizabeth and Margaret was real enough that its betrayal remained, to the end, something she could not fully absorb. The papers also revealed something about the specific nature of the Queen Mother's involvement in the aftermath of the book that the palace had managed carefully in the years between 1950 and 2000. The palace's public position had been consistent. Marion Crawford had betrayed a trust, the family had been hurt and shocked, and the estrangement that followed was the natural consequence of a breach of confidence. The documents suggested a more active picture. The Queen Mother had not merely withdrawn from Marion Crawford in the shock of genuine betrayal. She had managed the situation, communicated with intermediaries, applied pressure through the mechanisms available to her, and maintained the estrangement not merely through personal hurt but through institutional decision-making that was deliberate and sustained. This is a distinction that matters, though it is a subtle one. The difference between a person who genuinely cannot forgive a hurt and a person who has decided, as an institutional matter, that the estrangement must be maintained regardless of personal feeling, is the difference between human grief and calculated policy. The documents suggested the latter was at least as present as the former in the Queen Mother's management of the Marion Crawford situation. The documentary aired in 2000. The Queen Mother was 100 years old. She had been maintaining the silence, in one form or another, for 50 years. She died 2 years later without having addressed the substance of what the documents revealed. The papers sat with Marion Crawford's solicitor. The truth that Crawford wanted to come out came out, partially, in a documentary that aired at midnight on a cable channel, to an audience that was a fraction of the audience that had read The Little Princesses in 1950. The institution had managed the situation for 50 years, and by the time the counter-narrative had access to the public's attention was largely elsewhere. This is how institutional time management works in practice. The institution can afford to wait, the individual cannot. Marion Crawford could not wait 50 years for the truth to emerge. She died in 1988. The truth she wanted out arrived in 2000, 12 years after she could no longer hear it. 2 years before the woman who had maintained the silence for half a century died at 101. The timing is not poetic, it is structural. The institution had outlasted the individual, as institutions always do, and by the time the documents emerged to complicate the institutional narrative had already done its work. The verb had been coined. The cautionary tale had been told and retold. The name Crawford had been deployed as a warning for 50 years. A Channel 4 documentary at midnight could not undo 50 years of accumulated narrative weight. What it could do, and what it did, was begin the process of historical reassessment that Nigel Estelle had waited for. The reassessment has been slow. It has proceeded through academic papers and biographers' footnotes and novelists' reimaginings and a reprinting of The Little Princesses in 2020 with a new introduction by Jenny Bond. It has not produced a formal acknowledgement from the institution. The institution does not do formal acknowledgements of the people it has erased. The acknowledgement would require the institution to admit that the erasure was at minimum partially unjust. And institutional acknowledgements of partial injustice are extraordinarily rare, because they open questions the institution is not equipped to answer about what other partial injustices might deserve similar examination. But the reassessment is real, and it is continuing, and it is doing the work that Marion Crawford hoped it would do, even if the doing is happening much later than she hoped and in forms she could not have anticipated. The box of papers held by her solicitor, the letters she would not use to defend herself, the notes from a friend who waited until after her death to say what she had been too loyal to say herself. These were the instruments of a truth that arrived late. Too late for Marion Crawford, not too late for history. There is a photograph taken sometime in the late 1930s in the grounds of a Scottish estate on a day that looks cold even in black and white. Two little girls stand in the frame, coats buttoned to the collar, faces turned slightly toward the camera. Between them and slightly behind, almost out of frame, stands a tall woman with dark hair and a composed expression. She is not the subject of the photograph. She is never the subject of the photograph. But she is there. She was always there. And the documents in a box held by her solicitor in Aberdeen proved it, in the end, in ways that the institution had spent 50 years trying to prevent. She had been there. She had done the work. She had loved the children, and the children had loved her, and the institution had decided that this love was its property rather than hers, and had acted accordingly, and had maintained that position for 50 years with the same thoroughness with which it maintained every other position it adopted. The papers said otherwise. The papers said she had been telling the truth, and the papers had been sitting in a box in Aberdeen for 12 years, waiting for someone to open them. There is a particular kind of injustice that operates not through violence or explicit coercion, but through the slow, sustained application of institutional silence. It is the kind of injustice that is difficult to name in the moment, because the mechanisms that produce it are individually defensible. A family chooses not to maintain contact with someone who violated their trust. A cottage that was never technically hers is reclaimed. A name is allowed to become associated, over time, with a particular kind of moral failure. None of these actions, examined individually, carries the weight of what the whole sequence represents. It is only when you set them side by side and trace the line from the young woman arriving at the household of the Duke and Duchess of York in 1933 to the woman dying alone in a nursing home in Aberdeen in 1988 that the full shape of what was done to Marion Crawford becomes visible. She was born in Gateshead in 1909. She trained as an educator at Moray House in Edinburgh. She intended to spend her professional life working with children who had nothing. Children in the slums of Edinburgh who needed someone to fight for them. She was 22 years old and she had a plan, and she had the skills and the conviction to execute it. Then the Duchess of York turned her charm up to 11 on a young Scottish teacher at her sister's house in Edinburgh, and Marion Crawford came south for a trial month, and the trial month became 17 years, and the 17 years became 38 years of silence, and the silence became a nursing home, and the nursing home became a death in February 1988 with no flowers from the people she had loved. Between the young woman with the plan and the old woman in the nursing home, there was a life, not the life she had planned. The life the institution gave her in place of the one it took. And within that life, Marion Crawford did work that mattered, that was genuinely significant by any honest measure, and that the institution has spent 75 years doing its best to reduce to a cautionary tale about a disloyal servant. She raised a queen. This is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. Queen Elizabeth II spent the most formative years of her life in daily proximity to Marion Crawford, and the qualities that would define her reign, the composure, the steadiness, the serious attentiveness, the genuine engagement with the human dimensions of the role, were shaped in part by the woman who taught her to read and took her on the underground, and organized Christmas pantomimes in the dungeons of Windsor Castle, and believed, through 2 decades of institutional resistance, that the girls in her care needed access to the ordinary world in order to become extraordinary people. Marion Crawford was right about this. The evidence is Elizabeth's 70-year reign. The evidence is the degree to which Elizabeth adapted to changing expectations across 7 decades, engaged with her subjects with a warmth that was real, navigated crises with a steadiness that the role demanded, and that her formation had helped to make possible. Marion Crawford contributed to this. The institution would prefer that contribution remain unacknowledged. The contribution was real regardless of the institution's preference. She also wrote a book. The book was warm and true and historically valuable, and the palace called it Betrayal. 75 years of readers have called it something closer to a gift. Both verdicts are, in their way, accurate descriptions of the same document, depending on whose interests you place at the center of the assessment. If you place the palace's interest in controlling its own narrative at the center, the book was a betrayal. If you place the public interest in understanding the human reality of the people who shape national history at the center, the book was a contribution. Marion Crawford was not able to choose which framework would be applied to her work. The institution chose for her. The institution had more resources and more time and a better established relationship with the press, and its choice of framework held for decades. It did not hold forever. The papers in the solicitor's box, the Channel 4 documentary, the reprinting in 2020, the novels and the plays and the academic reassessments that have accumulated in the years since Marion Crawford's death. These are the slow machinery of historical correction, and they have been at work on her case for decades, and the picture they have produced is materially different from the one the palace constructed in the autumn of 1950 and maintained through the decades that followed. The picture they have produced is this: a woman of considerable professional skill and genuine moral seriousness who gave 17 years of her life to an institution that rewarded her inadequately and treated her departure as a violation of terms she had never fully understood. A woman who wrote a book in circumstances that were more complicated than the palace acknowledged, that were shaped by her husband's pressure and a publisher's contract and the British government's own involvement in the project. A woman whose book was, by any honest reading, an act of love toward the people it described. A woman who refused, for 38 years, to defend herself using the private correspondence that could have shifted public understanding of her case, because defending herself in that way would have required her to do again what the palace had already condemned her for doing. A woman who hoped, quietly and with a fidelity that the palace did nothing to deserve, for a reconciliation that never came. This is not the story of a traitor. It is the story of a woman who was loyal to an institution that had perfected the art of converting loyalty into a resource, and then, when the resource was no longer convenient, converting the person who had provided it into a warning. The institution converted her into a warning, doing a Crawford, the verb that was meant to keep the next generation of oysters closed, the verb that was meant to ensure that what happened to Marion Crawford would happen to no one else, because everyone else would understand what the consequences looked like and would choose, rationally, not to risk them. The verb did not work as intended. The people who came after Marion Crawford and found themselves inside the same institution and subject to the same pressures did not ultimately stay silent. Diana spoke, Burrell published, Harry wrote, "The code that Marion Crawford's punishment was designed to protect has been violated so thoroughly, and by people so much more visible and so much harder to erase than a Scottish governess in Aberdeen, that the code itself has been permanently altered. The palace now uses formal confidentiality agreements because the unwritten code, the one maintained through social pressure and institutional loyalty and the threat of becoming the next Crawford, could not hold in an era of direct public communication and global media. Marion Crawford's punishment did not prevent the pattern from continuing. It established the template for how the pattern looked when the institution applied it. Every subsequent case has been measured against it, consciously or not, and in every subsequent case the question has been the same. Is this another Crawford? Is this another person who gave everything to an institution that has now decided they are dispensable, and who is telling the truth about what that experience was like? Sometimes the answer has been yes, and the institution has been less able, each time, to make the yes stick, because the world outside the palace has been less willing, each decade, to accept the institutional verdict without examining the evidence. Marion Crawford had no platform to counter the narrative the palace built around her. She had no social media, no friendly journalist with a global audience, no sympathetic documentary maker who could reach viewers directly with a competing account. She had letters she would not use, a friend she asked to wait, and a house 200 yards from the Balmoral Road. The people who came after her had more. They had television interviews and streaming platforms and memoirs published in dozens of languages and audiences in the hundreds of millions. They were harder to erase, not impossible but harder, and with each case, the template that Marion Crawford's punishment had established became a little more visible, a little more recognizable, a little more clearly the pattern it had always been, rather than the individual moral failure the palace had always presented it as. Marion Crawford did not know any of this would happen. She died in 1988, before the internet, before streaming, before the era in which a person the palace had decided to erase could reach more people in an afternoon than the palace's entire communications apparatus could reach in a month. She died in a nursing home in Aberdeen, hoping that the truth would eventually come out, trusting that the letters in her solicitor's box would eventually say what she had been too loyal to say herself. The truth came out, partially slowly in forms she could not have anticipated, but it came out. The box was opened, the papers were examined, the Channel 4 documentary aired, the novels and the plays accumulated, the book was reprinted. Historians looked at the evidence and concluded, in the careful language of historical assessment, that the standard account was incomplete, that the circumstances were more complicated than the palace had acknowledged, that the punishment was disproportionate to the breach, and that Marion Crawford deserved to be remembered as something other than a cautionary tale about a disloyal servant. She had known all of this. She had known it from inside the Aberdeen house, from inside the silence, from inside 38 years of waiting. She had known that the palace's version was not the whole truth. She had known that the evidence existed to complicate it. She had chosen, year after year, not to use that evidence because she could not bring herself to be the thing the palace had decided she was. That choice, the choice to remain loyal to people who had been entirely disloyal to her, is the thing that the palace's version of her story most consistently fails to account for. The palace's version requires Marion Crawford to be a calculating agent of her own downfall, a woman who chose self-interest over loyalty and was punished accordingly. The choice she made in Aberdeen, the choice to hold the letters rather than use them, to wait for a reconciliation rather than fight for a vindication, to trust that the truth would eventually emerge rather than forcing its emergence at the cost of the people she had loved. That choice is not the choice of a woman motivated by self-interest. It is the choice of a woman motivated by love, the same love that had kept her in a castle in wartime when she could have left, the same love that had organized Christmas pantomimes in dungeons so that two frightened children could feel that life was still worth something, the same love that had walked two small princesses through the London Zoo and onto the Underground and into the Udosea for tea, because she believed, with the conviction of someone who had trained specifically to understand what children need, that they deserved access to the world outside the palace walls. She gave them the world outside the palace walls. She gave them, in the specific and practical ways available to a governess in the 1930s and 1940s, a form of contact with ordinary human experience that the institution had always preferred to deny them. She believed this would make them more complete as people and more capable as royals. And then the institution erased her. It erased her name from public acknowledgement. It erased her from the circle of people the royal family recognized. It erased her cottage and her medal and the practical security that 17 years of service should have earned. It erased her from the Christmas card list. It erased her from the wreath list. But there is one thing the institution did not erase and could not erase, and it is the thing that makes the whole story worth telling 75 years after the book appeared, and nearly 40 years after the woman who wrote it died. It did not erase the work. The work is still there. The Queen Marion Crawford helped raise, sat on the throne for 70 years, and the qualities she brought to that throne were shaped, in part, by the woman who took her on the Underground. The book Marion Crawford wrote, the one the palace called betrayal and the readers called a gift, is still in print and still being read. The truth she wanted out has been coming out, slowly, in the forms available to it, and is still coming. Marion Crawford went to Gateshead in East Ayrshire, and she intended to spend her life doing something that mattered. She did not spend it the way she planned. She spent it inside an institution that took everything she had and gave back less than she deserved, that converted her loyalty into a resource and her love into a liability and her name into a verb. But the work was done. The children were raised. The book was written. The letters were kept. The truth was waiting in a box. She was a woman from a working-class Scottish town who walked into the most powerful family in Britain and spent 17 years making those children better at being human. She postponed her own life to do it. She lost the children she might have had. She gave the best years of her professional life to an institution that did not know how to value what she gave. And then she sat in Aberdeen and waited, and the motorcade passed without stopping, and she did not use the letters, and she hoped. She was 78 years old when she died. She had been waiting for 38 years. The truth is still coming. It comes in pieces, in reprints and documentaries and plays, and the patient work of historians who believe that the complete record matters. It comes imperfectly, with the gaps that are always present when an institution has spent decades managing what is known. It comes late. Marion Crawford wanted it out. Her friend waited until after her death to say so. The solicitor kept the box. The papers endured. She had raised a queen and written a book, and hoped for a letter that never came, and kept the letters that would have defended her, and refused to use them because she was loyal to the end, to people who had made clear 38 years before the end that her loyalty was no longer required or welcome. The institution called her a traitor. The evidence calls her something else entirely. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.